Most people think they know what life was like in ancient Rome. They imagine gladiators, togas, and emperors ruling with iron fists. But the reality of living during the Roman Empire's golden age was far more fascinating and complex than any movie could show. Picture a world where 1 million people crowded into a single city, where running water flowed to apartments 6 stories high, where people from Britain to Egypt all called themselves Roman. This wasn't just an empire, it was humanity's first global civilization. The daily rhythms, the social drama, the very air people breathed, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In this video, we'll explore what it really meant to wake up, work, eat, and dream during Rome's most powerful centuries. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel, and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. There's something almost magical about stepping into ancient Rome at its most magnificent moment. Imagine a world where a single city's influence stretched so far that you could walk for months in any direction and still find yourself under Roman rule. From the misty shores of Britain all the way down to the scorching sands of Africa, from the rocky coasts of Spain clear across to the rich river valleys of modern-day Iraq. One eagle's shadow covered it all. Rome itself pulsed like a living heart at the center of this vast body. The city breathed with the rhythm of 1 million souls, each one playing their part in this grand human symphony. Walking through its streets would have been like stepping into the world's first truly international metropolis, where languages mixed and mingled, where the scent of exotic spices drifted from distant provinces, where marble gleamed white against blue Mediterranean skies. Picture the morning sounds drifting through the air, vendors calling out their wares in a dozen different accents, children's laughter echoing off stone walls, the clip-clop of horses carrying important messages to far-off lands. Yet turn a corner, and you might find yourself in a peaceful garden where fountains whispered secrets to the wind, or in the warm embrace of the public baths where steam rose like incense toward painted ceilings. The people who called this empire home came from every walk of life you could imagine. At the very top lived the patricians, those fortunate few who seemed to have been born with golden spoons in their mouths. Their homes weren't just houses, they were works of art themselves, with floors that told stories in tiny colored stones, walls painted with scenes of gods and heroes, gardens that bloomed with flowers from across the known world. These wealthy families spent their days weaving the intricate webs of politics, hosting dinner parties that could last from sunset to sunrise, making decisions that would ripple across continents. Below them in society's ladder, but no less important to the empire's daily heartbeat, lived the plebeians. These were the hands that built Rome's monuments, the voices that filled its markets, the minds that solved its everyday problems, farmers who coaxed grain from Italian soil, craftsmen whose skilled fingers shaped clay and metal into objects of beauty and usefulness, traders who knew the value of silk from China and amber from the Baltic shores. They might not have lived in marble palaces, but they had their own power, their own voice in how their city was run. What's fascinating is how these Romans looked backward to move forward. They fell in love with the wisdom of Greece, those earlier philosophers and poets who had pondered life's big questions under different skies. Greek tutors taught Roman children. Greek ideas shaped Roman thoughts. Greek beauty inspired Roman art, yet somehow, in absorbing all this ancient wisdom, the Romans created something entirely new, something distinctly their own. The great writers of this time understood something profound about human nature. Poets like Virgil captured the epic sweep of destiny, while thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, who happened to be an emperor, wrote private notes to himself about how to live a good life. Notes that people still read today when they're struggling with their own challenges. There's something deeply moving about an emperor, with all the power in the world, reminding himself to stay humble, to be kind, to remember that everything passes away. But empires, like people, carry contradictions within themselves. For all its grandeur, Roman society rested on foundations that we would find deeply troubling today. Millions of people lived their entire lives as property, bought and sold like cattle, their dreams and hopes counting for nothing in the grand scheme of imperial glory. The distance between the wealthy and the poor stretched like a vast canyon, with very few bridges allowing someone to cross from one side to the other. Governing such a massive, diverse empire presented challenges that would test any system. Imagine trying to keep peace among peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, had different ideas about how life should be lived. Rebellions flared up like brushfires, especially in places far from Rome's direct gaze, where local customs ran deep and Roman ways felt foreign and imposed. Yet somehow, for centuries, this unlikely system held together. Roman roads carried not just soldiers and tax collectors, but ideas and innovations. Roman law provided a framework that different peoples could understand and follow. Roman citizenship, gradually extended to more and more inhabitants of the empire, gave people a stake in this vast community's success. The Romans knew how to throw a party, that's certain. The Colosseum wasn't just a building, it was a stage where human drama played out in its most extreme forms. Gladiators, many of them slaves or criminals, fought for their lives while crowds cheered. But sometimes, when a fighter showed exceptional courage, those same crowds would demand mercy. The emperor would listen to their voices, thumb up or thumb down, life or death, decided by popular opinion. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus created the world's first sports superstars. Drivers became household names, their victories celebrated across the empire, their crashes mourned like national tragedies. 250,000 people could pack into that massive stadium, more than many modern cities hold, all united in cheering for their favorite colors, green or blue, red or white. These spectacles served purposes beyond mere entertainment. They were pressure valves for social tensions, ways for the masses to feel connected to their rulers, demonstrations of imperial power and generosity. An emperor who put on good games was an emperor who understood his people's needs. The religious life of Romans reflected their empire's diversity. They began with their own ancient gods, deities who had supposedly founded their city, and blessed their expansion. Jupiter ruled the heavens, Mars governed war, Minerva presided over wisdom. But as Roman legions marched into new territories, Roman hearts opened to new spiritual possibilities. Egyptian mystery religions, Persian concepts of good and evil, Celtic nature worship, all found homes within the empire's broad spiritual umbrella. This religious tolerance, born partly from practical necessity and partly from genuine curiosity, created a marketplace of ideas where different concepts of the divine could coexist and cross-pollinate. Of course, this would eventually include a small Jewish sect that worshipped a crucified carpenter, a movement that would ultimately transform the empire itself. Daily life in this ancient world moved to rhythms we've largely forgotten. People woke with the sun and slept soon after it set, unless they were wealthy enough to afford oil for lamps. They ate bread and olive oil, wine and honey, foods that connected them to the Mediterranean landscape they inhabited. Most Romans bathed more regularly than people would for centuries afterward, understanding cleanliness as both a physical and social necessity. The empire's achievements in engineering still inspire wonder today. Aqueducts carried fresh water across hundreds of miles, using nothing but gravity and human ingenuity. Roads built to last forever connected distant provinces, many still serving travelers 2,000 years later. Buildings reached toward the sky with architectural innovations that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Roman Empire was its temporary permanence. It felt eternal to those who lived within it. This vast system seemed as natural and unchanging as the seasons themselves. Citizens couldn't imagine a world without Roman law, Roman roads, Roman order. The very phrase Roman peace suggested something that transcended ordinary human limitations. But empires, like everything else humans create, contain the seeds of their own transformation. The very success that made Rome great eventually brought challenges too complex for any single system to solve permanently. Still, For those few centuries when Roman civilization flowered at its peak, it offered something unprecedented, a glimpse of what human organization and ambition could achieve when applied on a truly grand scale. Picture yourself walking through the ancient streets of Rome, where the echoes of history still whisper stories of a civilization that shaped our world. The Romans, you see, were people just like us, dealing with everyday problems, celebrating victories, and trying to make sense of their place in the universe. When you looked up at the Roman skyline, two magnificent structures dominated everything around them. The Colosseum stood like a giant stone crown, where thousands would gather to watch spectacles that both thrilled and horrified. Then there was the Pantheon, with its mysterious dome that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. These weren't just buildings, they were statements, declarations that Rome had conquered, not just lands, but the very art of construction itself. But here's something interesting about Roman life. Most people didn't live in grand palaces or beautiful villas. The average Roman family squeezed into what they called an insula, which was basically an ancient apartment building. These structures, well, they weren't exactly built to last. Imagine living in a building that might catch fire, or worse, collapse on any given Tuesday. That was reality for millions of Romans, a reminder that even in the mightiest empire, ordinary people faced ordinary struggles. The wealthy, of course, lived differently. Their homes, called domus, were like little private worlds. Picture walking into one of these residences, your footsteps echoing in courtyards, surrounded by rooms decorated with intricate mosaics that told stories in tiny colored stones. Frescoes painted on walls brought mythological scenes to life, creating an atmosphere where art and daily life danced together. Family meant everything in Roman society, but not in the way we might think today. The father, the paterfamilias, held a kind of power that's almost impossible to imagine now. His authority stretched over everyone in his household, his wife, his children, his slaves, binding them all together like threads in a tapestry. Yet, surprisingly, Roman women enjoyed freedoms that would have seemed revolutionary in other ancient cultures. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce their husbands, something that speaks to a complexity in Roman society that often gets overlooked. Slavery, though, was woven into the very fabric of Roman life. Slaves weren't just laborers, they were teachers, accountants, doctors, artists. Some lived lives of relative comfort, trusted with important responsibilities, while others endured backbreaking work in mines and fields. It's a reminder that progress and cruelty often walked hand in hand in the ancient world, just as they sometimes do today. The Romans understood something profound about civilization, that it flows like water, and water needs channels to reach where it's needed most. Their roads stretched across continents like stone rivers, carrying ideas, goods, and armies to the furthest corners of their empire. But perhaps even more impressive were their aqueducts, these graceful stone bridges that carried fresh water across valleys and hills, bringing life to cities that might otherwise have withered in the heat. Think about sitting down to a Roman meal. The table would likely be simple but satisfying. Wheat and barley formed the foundation of most meals, transformed into bread that sustained millions. Fruits and vegetables added color and flavor, while the wealthy enjoyed meat, fish, and spices that had traveled thousands of miles to reach their plates. Wine flowed freely, not just as a luxury, but as a daily necessity, safer to drink than water in many cases. Education mattered deeply to Romans, perhaps because they understood that knowledge was another form of power. Wealthy families hired private tutors to shape young minds, while public schools offered learning to those who couldn't afford private instruction. Children learned to read, write, and calculate, but they also learned about character, about what it meant to be a good Roman citizen. Religion touched everything in Roman life, like morning sunlight filtering through every window of their world. They worshipped many gods and goddesses, each one responsible for different aspects of existence. Mars governed war, Venus ruled love, Ceres watched over harvests. The Romans believed that keeping these divine forces happy through rituals and sacrifices, what they called pietas, was essential for both personal and societal well-being. Yet beneath all this grandeur, problems simmered like water in a covered pot. The gap between rich and poor stretched wide as a canyon. While some Romans lived in luxury, others struggled to find enough food for their families. The government, perhaps recognizing this tension, provided spectacular entertainment, gladiatorial games, and chariot races that gave people something exciting to focus on instead of their daily hardships. These entertainments revealed something fascinating about human nature. Even in an empire that prided itself on discipline and order, people craved excitement, drama, the thrill of uncertainty. The roar of crowds in the Colosseum wasn't so different from the cheers in modern stadiums. A reminder that some aspects of human experience remained constant across the centuries. As we consider this ancient civilization from our modern perspective, we see a society of contradictions. Romans built monuments that have lasted 2,000 years, yet many of their apartment buildings couldn't survive a decade. They created legal systems we still study today. While accepting slavery as natural, they worshipped gods of wisdom and justice, while cheering as gladiators fought to the death. Perhaps that's what makes Roman civilization so fascinating and so relatable. They were people trying to build something lasting in an uncertain world, dealing with the same fundamental challenges we face today. How do we balance individual freedom with social order? How do we create prosperity without leaving people behind? How do we honor the past while adapting to change? The Roman Empire eventually faded, but its influence flows through our world, like those ancient aqueducts carried water. Our languages, our laws, our architecture, even our calendar bear the marks of Roman innovation. When we walk through any modern city, we're following paths first laid down by Roman engineers and urban planners who understood that civilization is built one stone at a time, one decision at a time, one generation passing wisdom to the next. Picture yourself wandering through the streets of an ancient Roman city, where every corner tells a story of human ambition and clever design. The Romans had this fascinating way of thinking about cities, not just as places where people happened to live, but as grand stages for civilization itself. You know, it's funny how the heart of every Roman settlement wasn't a castle or a palace, but a wide open space called the Forum. This public square buzzed with life from dawn to dusk, where merchants hawked their wares, politicians gave rousing speeches, and neighbors caught up on the latest gossip. The Forum wasn't just one thing to everyone, it was whatever the community needed it to be at any given moment. In the great city of Rome itself, there were actually multiple forums, each one carrying its own personality and purpose. Some specialized in trade, others in legal matters, and still others served as gathering places for religious ceremonies. It's almost like each forum was its own little village within the great metropolis. Now, if you wanted to truly impress visitors to your Roman city, you needed something spectacular, something that would make their jaws drop. The Colosseum stands as the ultimate example of this Roman flair for the dramatic. This massive stone amphitheater could hold 50,000 people, all cheering and gasping at the spectacles unfolding on the arena floor below. But here's what's really interesting: even the smallest Roman towns had their own amphitheaters. Sure, they might not have been as grand as the Colosseum, but they served the same purpose, bringing communities together for entertainment and shared experiences. Every Roman settlement, no matter how humble, deserved its moment of glory. The Romans approached city building with the precision of a master craftsman. They laid out their streets in perfect grids, with two main roads forming the backbone of every settlement. The Cardo ran north to south, while the Decumanus stretched east to west. And where these two great arteries met, that's where you'd find the beating heart of the city. This grid system wasn't just about making cities look neat and orderly, though the Romans certainly appreciated that. It made navigation simple for visitors and residents alike, and it divided the urban landscape into manageable chunks that could be developed systematically. Walking down these streets, you'd find them lined with shops and market stalls, creating a vibrant tapestry of commerce and daily life. Water, that most precious of resources, flowed into Roman cities through some of the most ingenious structures ever built. The aqueducts snaked across the landscape for miles, carrying fresh, clean water from mountain springs and distant rivers directly to the urban centers. These weren't just practical constructions. They were monuments to Roman engineering genius, using nothing but gravity and careful calculation to deliver life-sustaining water to millions of people. Some of these ancient aqueducts still function today, nearly 2,000 years after Roman engineers first designed them. Think about that for a moment. Structures built before the fall of the Western Roman Empire are still serving communities in the modern world. That's the kind of lasting impact that comes from truly understanding your craft. Of course, what goes in must come out, and the Romans tackled this less glamorous aspect of city life with the same methodical approach. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system, formed a vast underground network that whisked away waste and stormwater, keeping the streets clean and reducing the spread of disease. It might not have been the most important for daily life. Roman homes reflected the social hierarchy that defined their society. The wealthy lived in spacious houses called domus, complete with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard. These homes often featured their own private baths, elaborate gardens, and beautifully decorated walls that told stories through colorful frescoes. Most city dwellers, however, made their homes in multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae. The ground floor typically housed shops and businesses, while families occupied the upper floors. It was an efficient use of space that allowed cities to accommodate large populations within their walls. But perhaps nowhere did Roman social life flourish more than in the public baths. These weren't simple places to get clean, they were elaborate social centers that served as the beating heart of community life. The baths of Caracalla in Rome exemplified this concept on a grand scale, offering hot and cold pools, steam rooms, exercise facilities, and even libraries where bathers could stimulate their minds along with their bodies. Imagine spending your afternoon moving from pool to pool, chatting with friends and neighbors, perhaps engaging in a philosophical debate, or simply enjoying the luxury of hot running water. The baths represented Roman civilization at its most refined, where cleanliness, leisure, and intellectual pursuit all came together under one magnificent roof. The Romans understood something profound about human nature, that people thrive when their basic needs are met efficiently, and when they have spaces to gather, socialize, and celebrate together. Their cities weren't just functional, they were designed to elevate the human experience, to make ordinary life feel a little more extraordinary. This attention to both the practical and the beautiful, the necessary and the luxurious, helped create urban environments that supported not just survival, but genuine prosperity. Roman city planning reflected a deep wisdom about what makes communities work, lessons that urban designers still study and apply. Reflected in 9:1. Picture yourself wandering through the ancient streets of Rome, when the empire stretched across 3 continents, and the world seemed to revolve around this magnificent city. The air carries the scent of olive oil, fresh bread, and something else, something distinctly Roman, that made this place unlike anywhere else on earth. Now imagine the most remarkable thing about Roman life, something that might surprise you. The poorest citizen and the wealthiest senator could find themselves soaking in the same warm pools, sharing the same steam-filled rooms. These weren't just places to get clean. These Roman baths were like community centers, shopping malls, and country clubs, all rolled into one. The Romans understood something we sometimes forget today, that cleanliness wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul of a community. The baths of Caracalla, one of the most impressive examples, could hold over 1,000 people at once. Think about that for a moment. A building larger than most modern shopping centers, dedicated entirely to relaxation and social connection. You could spend an entire day there, moving from hot pools to cold plunges, getting a massage, reading in the library, or listening to a philosopher debate the meaning of life. Water flowed through these buildings like magic, heated by massive furnaces that burned day and night. Slaves worked below ground, invisible to the berthers above, feeding wood into fires that kept the water at perfect temperatures. The Romans had figured out something we're still trying to master, how to make luxury accessible to almost everyone. But step outside these peaceful baths, and you'd find yourself in a completely different world. The streets of Rome buzzed with an energy that would make modern New York seem quiet by comparison. Vendors called out their wares in dozens of languages, from Latin and Greek to Germanic dialects and tongues from the far reaches of Africa. The smell of roasting meat mixed with exotic spices from India and China. Carts rumbled over stone streets, their wooden wheels creating a constant thunder that echoed off apartment buildings that rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. These buildings, called insula, housed hundreds of thousands of ordinary Romans in spaces that would make a modern studio apartment seem spacious. Here's something fascinating about Roman apartment life. The higher you lived, the cheaper your rent, but the more dangerous your existence. The ground floors were reserved for shops and wealthy families, while the poor climbed narrow staircases to tiny rooms at the top. Fire was a constant threat, and when buildings collapsed, which happened more often than anyone liked to admit, it was always the people at the top who suffered most. Yet, even in these crowded conditions, Romans maintained their sense of dignity and community. They gathered in the courtyards of their buildings, shared meals, celebrated festivals together. Children played in the streets while their parents worked, creating a neighborhood atmosphere that bound people together across social lines. The heart of this great city beat strongest in the Forum Romanum, a space that served as the center of the known world. Here, marble columns rose toward the sky like frozen prayers, their surfaces carved with stories of conquest and glory. The Senate House stood here, where old men in white togas debated the fate of millions with words that could start wars or bring peace to entire continents. But the Forum wasn't just about politics and power. It was also the world's greatest marketplace, where you could buy silk from China, pearls from the Persian Gulf, amber from the Baltic Sea. Merchants displayed their goods on wooden tables, creating a kaleidoscope of colors and textures that dazzled the eye and emptied the purse. Something magical happened in the Forum every day around noon, when the sun reached its highest point and cast sharp shadows between the columns. The marble seemed to glow from within, and for a moment even the busiest Roman would pause and feel the weight of being part of something greater than themselves. Not far from the Forum's dignity and grandeur, you'd find a completely different kind of spectacle at the Circus Maximus. This enormous stadium, the largest ever built, could hold 250,000 people, more than many modern cities. On race days, the entire city would empty into this valley between the hills, creating a river of humanity flowing toward the excitement of chariot racing. The races themselves were more than sport. They were theater, religion, and politics, all mixed together. Each team had its colors: red, white, blue, green, and Romans supported their teams with a passion that sometimes erupted into riots. Fortunes were won and lost on single races, and the most successful charioteers became richer and more famous than movie stars today. But perhaps nothing captured the Roman spirit quite like the Colosseum, that massive amphitheater that still dominates the Roman skyline today. When it was new, it represented the height of engineering achievement, a building that could be flooded for mock naval battles one day and transformed into a forest for wild animal hunts the next. The games held here weren't just entertainment, they were a form of communication between the emperor and his people. Through the spectacles of gladiatorial combat, exotic animal displays, and elaborate theatrical productions, rulers could demonstrate their wealth, their power, and their care for the common citizen's happiness. Gladiators themselves lived in a strange world between slavery and celebrity. Most were prisoners of war or condemned criminals, yet the successful ones enjoyed luxuries that free Romans could only dream of. They had their own medical staff, their own trainers, even their own fan clubs. Some gladiators became so popular that their images appeared on oil lamps, mosaics, and children's toys throughout the empire. As evening approached in ancient Rome, the city would begin to transform once again. The wealthy retreated to their villas in the hills, homes decorated with intricate mosaics that told stories from mythology and history. These houses opened around central courtyards, where fountains played and gardens bloomed, creating private paradises within the urban chaos. The poor, meanwhile, gathered in taverns and inns that stayed open late into the night. These weren't fancy establishments, but they served their purpose, providing hot meals, cheap wine, and the company that makes life bearable, even in difficult circumstances. Romans loved to talk, to argue, to share stories, and these humble places became theatres where ordinary people could be philosophers, poets, and politicians for the price of a cup of wine. Music drifted from doorways and windows, the sound of flutes and lyres mixing with laughter and conversation. Street performers entertained passers-by with acrobatics, storytelling, and simple magic tricks. Even in a city of over 1 million people, Rome could feel intimate and personal when darkness fell and oil lamps began to twinkle like earthbound stars. The Romans had created something unprecedented in human history, a city that functioned as both the capital of a vast empire and a home to people from every corner of the known world. In Rome, you might hear a dozen languages in a single street, taste foods from 3 continents in one market, and witness the mixing of cultures that would shape the future of civilization itself. Picture, if you will, a city where over 1 million souls called home, during a time when most settlements barely reached a few thousand. This was Rome at her peak, a place where the morning sun would rise over a symphony of sounds that never truly ended. The clatter of wooden wheels on stone streets, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the splash of water from countless fountains. The Romans, you see, had figured out something remarkable about water. They built these incredible structures called aqueducts, stone channels that carried fresh mountain water across valleys and hills, sometimes for hundreds of miles. Water flowed into the city like liquid silver, feeding public fountains, private homes, and the famous Roman baths, where citizens would gather not just to wash, but to socialize, conduct business, and catch up on the latest gossip. These bathhouses were fascinating places, really. Imagine stepping into a world of warm pools, cold plunges, and rooms filled with steam, so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Romans would spend hours there, moving from hot rooms to cold ones, getting massages, playing games, even attending lectures on philosophy. It was like their version of a modern community center, spa, and library all rolled into one. Now, if you walked through the streets of Rome during those golden centuries, you'd notice something interesting about where people lived. The wealthy had beautiful houses with courtyards and gardens, but most Romans, perhaps 3/4 of them, lived in tall apartment buildings called insulae. These structures rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high, creaking and swaying in the wind like ancient skyscrapers. Life in these buildings was, well, precarious might be the right word. The higher up you lived, the cheaper your rent, but also the more dangerous your situation. Fire was an ever-present threat, and when it struck, it could consume entire blocks. The Romans eventually created one of the world's first organized fire brigades, complete with pumps, ladders, and teams of men ready to rush toward danger at a moment's notice. Food tells us so much about how people lived back then. A typical Roman would start their day with something light, maybe some bread dipped in wine, or perhaps some cheese and olives. Lunch was often grabbed on the run from street vendors, not unlike grabbing a sandwich from a food truck today. But dinner was where Romans truly expressed themselves. The evening meal could stretch for hours, with course after course appearing on low tables, while diners reclined on couches. Roman style, they'd feast on things we might find familiar, like roasted meats and fresh vegetables, alongside delicacies that might surprise us, such as dormice stuffed with herbs, or fish sauce that was as common to them as ketchup is to us. Entertainment in Rome was spectacle on a scale. The Circus Maximus, their greatest stadium, could hold 250,000 people. Picture every single person in a modern city cramming into one enormous oval to watch chariot races, the thunder of hooves echoing off stone walls while the crowd roared its approval. Then there were the gladiatorial games, those infamous contests that have captured imaginations for centuries. While brutal by our standards, to Romans they represented something deeper, perhaps a way to confront mortality, to see courage tested in its purest form. The gladiators themselves were often slaves or criminals, but the successful ones became celebrities, their names carved on pottery and their faces painted on walls. Religion wove through every aspect of Roman life like golden thread through fabric. Romans worshipped dozens of gods and goddesses, each with their own personalities, quirks, and areas of expertise. There was Jupiter, the king of gods who controlled thunder and lightning. Venus, goddess of love and beauty. Mars, the fierce god of war. Each neighborhood had its own protective deities, each household its own sacred spaces. Religious festivals punctuated the Roman calendar like colorful beads on a string. During these celebrations, normal life would pause as the entire city participated in processions, sacrifices, and feasts. The smell of incense would drift through the streets, mixing with the aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread. The emperor himself occupied a curious position in this religious landscape. Over time, Romans began to view their rulers as divine, or at least divinely appointed. This wasn't just political theater, it was a genuine belief that connected the earthly realm to the heavens, making the emperor not just a political leader, but a spiritual bridge between mortals and immortals. Roman innovation extended far beyond their famous roads and aqueducts, though those were certainly impressive. They developed concrete that could set underwater, allowing them to build harbors and bridges that lasted for centuries. They created a postal system that could carry messages across thousands of miles with remarkable efficiency. They even had a form of social welfare, providing free grain to citizens during times of hardship. Literature and learning flourished in this environment, like flowers in a well-tended garden. Romans gathered in libraries to read scrolls of poetry, philosophy, and history. They attended theatrical performances, where actors would bring ancient myths to life, or present comedies that poked fun at everyday situations that probably seemed as relevant then as they do now. The contrast between wealth and poverty in Rome was as stark as shadow and sunlight. While some Romans dined on delicacies imported from the far corners of the empire, others struggled to afford basic bread. Yet, this inequality coexisted with a remarkable social mobility that was unusual for the ancient world. Slaves could earn or be granted their freedom, freedmen could prosper, and even achieve positions of influence, and talented individuals could rise through the ranks, regardless of their birth. As night fell over this great city, oil lamps would flicker to life in windows throughout the insula, casting warm pools of light into the darkness. The sounds of the day would gradually give way to different rhythms. The clip-clop of late-night travelers, the distant sound of music from taverns, the gentle splash of fountains that never stopped flowing. Rome was a city that truly never slept, a place where the energy of a million dreams and ambitions created something larger than the sum of its parts. A civilization that would echo through history long after its last emperor had fallen. Picture a world where entertainment meant everything, where entire cities revolved around the simple human need for distraction and joy. The ancient Romans understood something we still chase today, that life without pleasure, without spectacle, becomes unbearably ordinary. In the heart of every Roman city, massive stone theaters rose like monuments to human creativity. These weren't just buildings, they were temples to storytelling. Thousands of people would gather, rich and poor sitting together, watching actors transform into gods and heroes. The performances ranged from tear-jerking tragedies to side-splitting comedies, but perhaps most fascinating were the pantomimes, where entire stories unfolded through dance and gesture alone. No words needed, just the universal language of movement. These theaters pulsed with life, becoming the beating heart of urban existence. But the plays weren't just escapism, they were mirrors reflecting society back to itself. Playwrights cleverly wove political commentary into their scripts, using comedy to criticize emperors, using tragedy to explore the weight of power. Audiences understood these hidden messages, sharing knowing glances when a character's downfall echoed a real politician's recent scandal. Yet Romans craved more than clever wordplay and artistic expression. They thirsted for something rawer, more primal. Enter the gladiatorial games, those infamous spectacles that still capture our imagination today. Picture the roar of 50,000 voices as two warriors circled each other in the arena, sunlight glinting off their armor, death hovering over every swing of the sword. These weren't just random fights thrown together for cheap thrills. Gladiatorial combat was carefully choreographed theater, where different fighting styles clashed like characters in an elaborate play. The Rhetarius with his net and trident faced off against the heavily armored Secutor. The crowd understood the nuances, the techniques, the strategies. They became experts in violence, connoisseurs of combat. Emperors discovered that nothing bought loyalty quite like a spectacular show. They poured fortunes into these games, importing exotic animals from Africa, staging mock naval battles in flooded arenas, creating spectacles so elaborate they bordered on the surreal. The message was clear: Rome was so powerful, so wealthy, it could afford to turn death into art. But between the drama and the bloodshed, Romans found gentler pleasures too. The bathhouse, or thermae as they called it, represented something beautiful about Roman civilization. These weren't just places to get clean. They were community centers, social clubs, and architectural marvels all rolled into one. Imagine stepping into one of these grand bathhouses. First, the tepidarium, pleasantly warm, where friends gathered to chat about business or gossip about the latest political scandal. Then the caldarium, thick with steam, where the heat seemed to melt away the day's worries. Finally, the frigidarium, shockingly cold, a bracing finish that left bathers feeling reborn. Beneath their feet, hypocauste systems circulated hot air, turning the floors into gentle radiators. The walls blazed with colorful mosaics depicting everything from sea creatures to mythological scenes. For many Romans, visiting the baths became a daily ritual, as essential as eating or sleeping. Rich and poor mingled in these spaces. Social barriers temporarily dissolved in the democratic embrace of hot water and steam. Food, too, revealed the complexity of Roman society. Wealthy Romans turned dining into performance art, hosting banquets that lasted for hours and featured dishes we can barely imagine today. Dormice stuffed with honey and nuts. Flamingo tongues considered the height of delicacy. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, flavored everything from vegetables to desserts. These elaborate feasts weren't just about showing off wealth, though that certainly played a part. They were carefully orchestrated social events where business deals were struck, political alliances formed, and marriages arranged. Guests reclined on couches, eating with their hands while being entertained by musicians, dancers, and poets. The host's reputation depended on the quality of both food and entertainment. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans lived on simpler fare. Bread formed the foundation of their diet, often distributed free by the government to keep the masses content. Olive oil, wine, and vegetables from small gardens supplemented their meals. Meat appeared only on special occasions, making it all the more precious when it did. This divide in cuisine reflected the rigid social pyramid that defined Roman life. At the top sat the emperor, wielding power that stretched across 3 continents. Below him, senators in purple-striped togas debated laws and governed provinces. The equestrian class managed trade and filled administrative roles. Citizens, both rich and poor, enjoyed legal protections and voting rights. At the bottom, slaves performed the labor that kept the empire functioning, yet this hierarchy wasn't completely fixed. Slaves could earn or buy their freedom, becoming freedmen with opportunities for advancement. Soldiers could rise through the ranks, earning land grants and respect. Merchants could amass fortunes that rivaled those of old aristocratic families. This possibility of advancement, however remote, gave people hope and helped stabilize the social order. Roman parents, especially wealthy ones, invested heavily in their children's education. Boys studied rhetoric, learning to argue cases in court or deliver speeches in the Senate. They memorized Homer's epics, studied Greek philosophy, and learned the art of persuasion. Girls from elite families also received education, though focused more on managing households and raising future citizens. Education meant status, opportunity, and connection to the broader Mediterranean world. A well-educated Roman could quote Virgil, debate Stoic philosophy, and navigate the complex etiquette of public life. Knowledge was power, and power was everything in Roman society. Religion wove through every aspect of daily life, like golden threads in a tapestry. Romans worshipped dozens of gods and goddesses, each with specific roles and personalities. Jupiter ruled the heavens with his thunderbolts. Venus governed love and beauty. Mars inspired warriors heading into battle. Household gods protected individual families, while city gods watched over entire communities. Temples dominated urban skylines, their marble columns and bronze statues proclaiming divine presence in the mortal world. Religious festivals marked the calendar, giving people regular breaks from work and reasons to celebrate. These weren't solemn, quiet affairs, but joyous public parties with processions, sacrifices, feasts, and games. The Romans created a civilization that was simultaneously familiar and alien to our modern eyes. They shared our love of entertainment, our desire for cleanliness, our complex social relationships. Yet they accepted slavery as natural, found pleasure in deadly spectacles, and structured society around rigid hierarchies that we would find suffocating. Their legacy echoes through our world in countless ways. Our languages carry Latin roots. Our legal systems trace back to Roman law. Our architecture borrows Roman arches and domes. Our very concept of republican government emerged from Roman experiments with shared power and civic duty. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine ourselves walking through a Roman city at twilight, hearing the distant roar from the amphitheater, smelling bread baking in corner shops, feeling the warmth rising from bathhouse chimneys. For a moment, we can touch that vanished world, understanding how people not so different from ourselves built something magnificent that still shapes our lives today. Picture yourself walking through the streets of ancient Rome during its golden age, when peace stretched across the known world. The Romans had figured out something quite remarkable about making a house feel like home. Water would fall from the sky, hit the opening they'd cleverly left in their roof, and collect in a beautiful shallow pool right in the center of their living space. This wasn't just practical, though it certainly was. It was elegant, bringing light and fresh air into every corner of the house. The wealthy Romans loved to show off, and their homes became their canvases. Imagine tiny colored tiles, each one placed by hand, forming pictures on the floor beneath your feet. Some showed simple patterns, geometric shapes that pleased the eye. Others told entire stories, scenes from old myths where gods and heroes lived their dramatic lives. Walking across these floors was like walking through an art gallery, except this gallery was someone's everyday living space. The walls told stories too. Artists would paint directly onto the wet plaster, creating scenes that seemed to open up the room to distant lands. You might see a garden that never existed, or a window looking out onto a landscape hundreds of miles away. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were statements. They whispered to visitors about the owner's wealth, their education, their refined taste. Now, if you were wealthy enough to own one of these grand homes called a domus, you'd have quite a few rooms to choose from. There was a special room just for dining, where you'd recline on couches rather than sit at a table. Your bedrooms were private retreats, and you'd have a study where business could be conducted away from the noise of daily life. The heart of it all was that central courtyard with its rainwater pool, where family life revolved like planets around the sun. But Rome wasn't just about the wealthy. Most people lived very different lives, packed into tall apartment buildings that creaked and swayed in the wind. These buildings, called insulae, were often hastily built and prone to catching fire. Families might share a single room where sleeping, eating, and living all happened in the same small space. Yet even in these crowded conditions, life found a way to flourish. The buildings buzzed with conversation, children's laughter, and the sounds of people making do and making the best of things. Food played different roles depending on your station in life. If you were among the common people, your meals were simple affairs, grain formed into bread or porridge, vegetables when you could get them, and meat or fish on special occasions. But if fortune had smiled upon you, dining became theatre. Wealthy Romans would host feasts that seemed to compete with the gods themselves, oysters from distant shores, exotic birds prepared in elaborate ways, wines from the finest vineyards, all accompanied by musicians, dancers and poets who would entertain between courses. The Romans took education seriously, though it looked quite different from what we know today. Until a child reached 7 years old, learning happened at home, with parents or tutors sharing knowledge in intimate settings. After that, formal schooling began, but it split along gender lines. Boys dove into reading, writing, mathematics, and the art of public speaking, skills they'd need in Rome's political world. Girls learned the domestic arts, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and managing households that could be quite complex. Every Roman home held something sacred. In a small shrine, usually tucked into a corner or alcove, the family would honor their household gods. These weren't the grand deities of the public temples, but intimate protectors, spirits, who watched over the family's daily life. The Romans believed these gods cared about whether the children were healthy, whether the food stores would last, whether the family would prosper. Religion wasn't something that happened only on special days. It wove itself into the fabric of ordinary life. Business and home life intertwined, into ways that might surprise us today. Many wealthy Romans operated shops or offices right from their houses, with slaves handling much of the actual work. The relationship between masters and slaves varied tremendously. Some treated as barely human, others welcomed almost as family members. This complex system powered much of Roman society, from the grandest mansions to the simplest workshops. The contrast between rich and poor was stark, yet both groups shared certain experiences. Both dealt with the unpredictability of fire in a world lit by oil lamps and heated by open flames. Both navigated streets that could be dangerous after dark. Both participated in religious festivals that brought the entire community together, regardless of social class. Both felt the pride of belonging to an empire that seemed to stretch to the very edges of the world. In these Roman homes, whether grand or humble, families gathered each evening as darkness fell across the 7 hills. Children learned stories passed down through generations, parents planned for tomorrow's challenges, and everyone found their place in a civilization that had grown far beyond what its founders could have ever imagined. Picture the grand marble halls of the Senate House, where Rome's most distinguished citizens gathered in their pristine white togas. These weren't just politicians, mind you, they were the cream of society, former magistrates who had earned their place through years of public service. The Senate operated like an exclusive gentlemen's club, where lifetime members would debate the fate of millions over fine wine and elaborate dinners. What's fascinating is how these senators held enormous influence, yet their power existed mostly in shadows and whispers. Their formal decisions, called senatus consulta, carried tremendous weight throughout the empire. But here's the curious thing. The emperor could essentially ignore them whenever he pleased. It was all an elaborate dance, really. The emperor would present his ideas to the Senate, knowing full well they would approve them. The senators would nod and discuss, fully aware they had no real choice in the matter. This delicate balance kept everyone happy, at least on the surface. The emperor maintained legitimacy by respecting tradition, while the Senate preserved their dignity and social status. It was political theatre at its finest, performed on history's grandest stage. Behind the marble columns and public ceremonies, the real business of running an empire happened in the emperor's household. The domus buzzed with constant activity, a sprawling administrative center where freedmen, slaves, family members and advisors all competed for influence. Imagine the intrigue, the whispered conversations in darkened corridors, the careful alliances formed and broken over breakfast. The emperor, despite wielding absolute power, could never truly rule alone. He relied on this complex web of relationships, this human machinery that processed the daily needs of governing millions of people. Factions would rise and fall within the court, each hoping to catch the emperor's ear to influence the next great decision. Meanwhile, far from the marble halls and political maneuvering, another kind of machinery kept the empire functioning. The Roman legions represented something entirely new in human history, a professional standing army that transformed warfare forever. These weren't farmers called to battle during planting season. These were career soldiers trained from youth in the arts of war and peace. Each legion contained roughly 5,000 men, organized with mathematical precision into smaller units called centuries. Despite the name, centuries typically held around 80 soldiers, a quirk of Roman military tradition that persisted for generations. But here's what made the legions truly remarkable. They weren't just warriors. They were engineers, builders, and peacekeepers, all rolled into one. Picture a Roman legion on the march, and you're seeing a mobile city. They carried their own medical staff, their engineers, their command structure, even small naval units for river crossings. When they stopped for the night, they would construct an entire fortified camp, complete with walls and watchtowers. By morning, they would dismantle everything and march on, leaving barely a trace behind. These same hands that wielded swords also built the roads that connected the empire. They constructed bridges that spanned mighty rivers, raised aqueducts that brought fresh water to distant cities. In peacetime, legions served as police forces, maintaining order in far-flung provinces where Roman law meant the difference between chaos and civilization. The genius of Roman military success lay not in superior numbers or advanced weapons, but in their remarkable adaptability. When Romans encountered a new enemy, they studied their tactics carefully. They observed their weapons, their formations, their strategies. Then, with characteristic pragmatism, they absorbed whatever worked into their own military doctrine. This willingness to learn from defeat, to evolve and improve, kept the Roman army effective across centuries of warfare. They faced Germanic tribes in dark forests, desert warriors in North Africa, mountain fighters in the Alps. Each encounter taught them something new, made them stronger and more versatile. The Roman navy, though less celebrated than the legions, played an equally vital role in imperial success. These ships protected the sea lanes that carried grain from Egypt, spices from the east, precious metals from Spain. Without naval security, the economic arteries of the empire would have collapsed. Sailors might not have enjoyed the prestige of legionnaires, but they understood their importance to Rome's prosperity. Military service offered something precious in the ancient world: a path to social advancement. Provincial men could earn Roman citizenship through army service, transforming their children's futures with 25 years of dedication. Veterans received land grants, retirement bonuses, and the respect that came with having served the empire faithfully. The hardships were real, certainly. Soldiers endured brutal training, dangerous campaigns, years away from home and family. But for many, military service represented their best chance at a better life. They could rise through the ranks based on merit, skill, and courage, rather than birth or wealth. This entire system, political and military, created something unprecedented in human history. An empire that functioned efficiently across 3 continents, incorporating dozens of cultures and languages into a single administrative framework. The checks and balances, the complex relationships, the innovative military machine, all worked together to create a civilization that endured for centuries. The legacy of these Roman innovations echoes through modern governments and armies around the world. The professional military, the separation of powers, the integration of diverse peoples under common law, these concepts that we take for granted today were revolutionary experiments in the marble halls and army camps of ancient Rome. Picture a time when the Mediterranean sun rose over a world that somehow feels both familiar and completely foreign to us. In the 2nd century after Christ, when Rome stood as the beating heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, ordinary people lived lives filled with rhythms we might recognize, yet details that would astonish us today. The Roman day began not with alarm clocks, but with the natural light creeping through small windows. As dawn broke over the eternal city, the sounds of awakening commerce would drift upward, vendors calling out their wares, wooden wheels clattering against stone streets, the rhythmic pounding of hammers on metal. These sounds became the heartbeat of a civilization that somehow managed to organize millions of people across vast distances, without any of the technology we take for granted. Most Romans lived in what we might call cramped conditions, sharing their homes with relatives, boarders, or anyone who could help split the cost of rent. Their buildings rose several stories high, made from that revolutionary Roman concrete and brick, topped with flat roofs that served as extra rooms under the open sky. Some families even managed small gardens up there, creating tiny green spaces above the bustling streets below. The morning meal tells us something beautiful about Roman priorities. Bread, cheese, a handful of olives, perhaps some dried fruit, simple foods that connected them to the land around the Mediterranean. They washed this down with something called posca, which was basically sour wine mixed with water. This wasn't about luxury, it was about practicality. Since clean water could be hard to come by, and alcohol helped kill dangerous bacteria. When the men left for work and women took charge of households, we see a society organizing itself in ways that made sense for their time. The Roman workday ended in early afternoon, not because they were lazy, but because they understood something we're only rediscovering now, that the human body has natural rhythms, and fighting against the scorching Mediterranean heat was simply impractical. But here's where Roman life becomes truly fascinating. After work, instead of collapsing in front of screens, Romans headed to the baths. These weren't just places to get clean. They were the social media of their time, the place where news traveled, business deals happened, friendships formed. The Roman bathhouse was a marvel of engineering, with heated floors, multiple pools at different temperatures, and a ritual that followed a careful sequence. First came the tepidarium, a warm room that gradually prepared the body. Then the caldarium, hot enough to open every pore and release the day's tensions. Finally, the shocking plunge into the frigidarium's cold water, a jolt that must have felt like being reborn. Many bathhouses included libraries, gymnasiums, even places to get a haircut and shave. Romans understood that civilization meant more than just survival. It meant creating spaces where people could flourish together. Their main meal, called cena, stretched across hours, turning eating into an art form of social connection. They might start with eggs or salad, move to meat or fish, finish with fruit or cakes, sweetened with honey. Wine flowed freely though, always diluted with water, because Romans believed that losing control was beneath the dignity of a civilized person. Roman evenings offered entertainment that seems both sophisticated and brutal to modern eyes. Some attended theatrical performances that explored the deepest questions of human nature, while others flocked to gladiatorial games where life and death played out for sport. Some Romans preferred quieter pleasures, gathering in taverns to gamble and drink, or simply walking through streets lit by flickering oil lamps, the ancient equivalent of street lighting. Yet beneath this picture of urban sophistication lay contradictions that reveal how different their world truly was. Slavery wasn't just accepted, it was fundamental to how their entire economy functioned. While some Romans enjoyed luxuries we can barely imagine, silk garments from distant China, spices from India, exotic animals from Africa, millions of others lived in conditions of grinding poverty or outright bondage. These contrasts remind us that human societies have always contained multitudes, grandeur existing, alongside suffering, innovation paired with cruelty, the mundane details of breakfast and bath time unfolding against the backdrop of an empire built on conquest. The Romans created something that lasted over 1,000 years, not because they were perfect, but because they found ways to organize complexity, to make diverse peoples feel part of something larger than themselves. When we imagine those oil lamps flickering against Roman walls 2,000 years ago, we're looking at people who worried about their children's futures, who fell in love, who struggled with work and money, who found joy in simple pleasures, just as we do today. Yet they did all this in a world where messages traveled only as fast as horses could run. where medical knowledge was limited, where the vast majority of people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Perhaps that's what makes Roman daily life so compelling to contemplate. This recognition that human nature remains constant even as the circumstances of life transform completely. Their morning routines and evening entertainments remind us that every age finds its own ways to create meaning, community, and beauty, even when those ways might seem strange to eyes from different times. Picture a world where peace stretched across continents for nearly 2 centuries, from the misty shores of Britain all the way down to the golden sands of Egypt, from the olive groves of Spain to the ancient rivers of Mesopotamia. This was the Roman world, a vast tapestry of cultures and peoples, all living under one remarkable umbrella of stability. At the center of it all sat Rome, a city that pulsed with the energy of over 1 million souls. Walking through its streets, you'd hear a symphony of languages: Greek merchants haggling over silk, Celtic traders discussing grain prices, Egyptian priests chanting ancient prayers. The city was like a great melting pot, bubbling with humanity from every corner of the known world. But this wasn't a world of equals, not by any stretch of the imagination. Roman society was built like a great pyramid, with each layer knowing exactly where it belonged. At the very top, the senators lived in their marble mansions, descendants of ancient families who could trace their bloodlines back centuries. These were the puppet masters pulling the strings of power from their cushioned counters. Just below them, the equestrians counted their coins and planned their next business ventures. They were the entrepreneurs of their age, the ones who made the empire's wheels turn with trade and commerce. Then came the vast majority, the plebeians, ordinary folks who could cast a vote but rarely had their voices heard above the din of politics. And at the bottom, invisible to history's eyes, were the slaves. Human beings treated as living tools, rowing the great ships that connected distant shores, building the monuments that still take our breath away today. Their stories were rarely written down, but without them, the empire would have crumbled in a day. The rhythm of Roman life followed the sun's journey across the sky. Dawn brought the opening of shops and the beginning of another day's labor. Bakers kneaded dough, while the city still slept. Blacksmiths fired up their forges, and teachers prepared their lessons. By afternoon, when the heat grew too intense, most work would wind down, and Romans would seek cooler pursuits. The public baths were like community centers, places where social barriers seemed to dissolve in the warm, steamy air. Here, a wealthy merchant might find himself soaking next to a struggling artisan, both sharing gossip about the latest political scandals or tomorrow's chariot races. These weren't just places to get clean, they were the heart of Roman social life. Romans had an almost childlike enthusiasm for games and entertainment. They'd gather around boards marked with intricate patterns, moving pieces in games that tested strategy and luck. Wrestling matches drew crowds in neighborhood squares, and horse racing could bring an entire district to a standstill as people cheered for their favorites. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the spectacle of the gladiatorial games. In those massive arenas, time seemed to stop as trained fighters faced impossible odds. The crowd's roar could be heard for miles, a primal sound that spoke to something deep in the human soul. These weren't just entertainment, they were rituals that bound the community together in shared excitement and terror. Food told its own story about Roman life. The common people started their day with simple fare, perhaps some bread dipped in wine, or a handful of olives. Their main meal at midday might include a thick porridge, some cheese, maybe an apple if they were lucky. Evening brought another light meal before the oil lamps were extinguished and sleep claimed the household. But step into a wealthy Roman's dining room and you'd enter a different world entirely. Tables groaned under the weight of peacock, prepared with exotic spices, wines from distant vineyards, and desserts that were works of art. These feasts could last for hours, with guests reclining on couches, discussing philosophy between courses. Education was the ladder that could lift a Roman child from obscurity to greatness. Wealthy families hired private tutors who would fill young minds with poetry and mathematics, while less fortunate children attended schools where they scratched their lessons into wax tablets. Boys and girls both learned to read and write, though the paths of higher learning usually diverged, with boys preparing for public life and girls for domestic roles. The invisible hand that guided all Roman life was religion. Every home had its sacred corner, where small statues of household gods watched over daily routines. These weren't distant, powerful deities, but intimate protectors who cared about whether the bread rose properly or the baby stopped crying. The great temples that dominated Rome's skyline were like theaters where the drama of divine interaction played out. Priests offered sacrifices, while crowds of worshippers looked on, hoping to catch a sign of divine favor. Soothsayers read the future in the flight patterns of birds or the arrangement of animal entrails, and their prophecies could change the course of empires. Religious festivals transformed the city into a carnival of devotion. Streets filled with processions carrying sacred objects, musicians played haunting melodies that drifted through open windows, and the air grew thick with incense and the smoke of countless offerings. These weren't just ceremonies, they were the threads that wove Roman society into a cohesive whole. This world of contradictions, where sublime art existed alongside brutal entertainment, where philosophical discussions happened, steps away from slave markets, created a civilization that still echoes through our modern world. The Romans built not just with stone and mortar, but with human dreams and ambitions, creating something that outlasted any individual life by centuries. Picture ancient Rome, where your place in the world was decided the moment you drew your first breath. The city sprawled across its famous 7 hills, and just like those hills created different levels in the landscape, Roman society itself was built in layers, each one stacked carefully above the other. At the very top of this social mountain lived the patricians. These weren't just wealthy people, they were something like royalty without crowns. Their families had been important for generations, sometimes stretching back centuries. They owned vast estates that rolled across the Italian countryside, worked by hundreds of hands that were never their own. When morning came to a patrician household, it brought with it a kind of leisurely ritual that most Romans could never imagine. These aristocrats would rise in their grand homes, often perched high on those hills, looking down over the bustling city below. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that those who lived highest up physically spent their days down in the heart of Rome, in the Forum. The Forum was their natural habitat, you might say. They'd gather there like birds of a feather, discussing the great matters of state, making decisions that would ripple out across the known world. Politics wasn't just their hobby. It was their birthright, their responsibility, and frankly, their entertainment all rolled into one. But politics wasn't the only thing that filled their days. Roman patricians had turned leisure into an art form. They'd attend religious ceremonies that were as much about seeing and being seen as they were about honoring the gods. And then there were the games, those spectacular, bloody affairs that drew crowds from every corner of the city. The highest office a patrician could reach was that of consul. Think of it as being president, but with a partner, because Romans were suspicious of giving too much power to just one person. 2 consuls ruled together, each keeping an eye on the other, each holding the power to veto what the other wanted to do. Far below the patricians, in every sense of the word, lived the plebeians. These were the backbone of Rome, the people who actually made the city work. They were the ones who grew the food, who hammered metal into tools and weapons, who built the roads and aqueducts that everyone marvels at today. Imagine being a plebeian farmer, waking up before dawn outside the city walls. Your hands were already rough from years of working the soil, coaxing wheat and barley from earth that could be generous or cruel, depending on the whims of weather and gods. You'd work until the sun was high and hot, then work some more until it began to sink toward the horizon. If you were a tradesman, your day might start in a small shop that doubled as your home. The smell of leather, or bread, or metalwork would fill your nostrils as you practiced the craft your father had taught you, and his father before him. Your customers were your neighbors, people who knew your family, who'd grown up alongside your children. For the plebeian soldiers, life meant months away from home, marching across distant lands under the eagle standards of Rome's legions. They'd return, if they were lucky, with stories of strange peoples and distant cities, maybe with enough loot to buy a small piece of land or expand their modest homes. The plebeians vastly outnumbered the patricians, but for the longest time, they had almost no say in how their city was governed. It was a bit like being the majority shareholders in a company, but having no voting rights. This created a tension that simmered beneath Roman society like a pot left too long on the fire. But the plebeians weren't content to simply accept this situation forever. Slowly, over decades and centuries, they began to push back. They won the right to elect tribunes, special officials whose job was to protect plebeian interests. These tribunes had an almost magical power. They could say no to the consuls themselves, vetoing decisions that would harm ordinary Romans. The line between patrician and plebeian wasn't always as clear as you might think. Some plebeians managed to climb that social ladder through cleverness, hard work, or simple good fortune. Maybe they'd make a killing in trade, literally and figuratively, buying and selling goods that flowed into Rome from across the Mediterranean. Others found their path to prosperity through military service. A clever soldier could catch the eye of his commanders, earn promotions, maybe even capture enough loot during a successful campaign to return home wealthy. These newly rich plebeians were called new men, and they often tried to live like patricians, building fancy houses and throwing lavish parties. But at the very bottom of Roman society, supporting everything else like the foundation stones of a great building, were the slaves. Slavery wasn't just accepted in Rome, it was essential to how everything worked. Slaves could be found everywhere, from the great agricultural estates to the humblest households in the city. Some slaves worked in the mines, descending into dark tunnels carved from rock to extract the silver and gold that helped fund Rome's expansion. Others labored in the fields under the burning Italian sun, harvesting the grain that fed the city's growing population. In wealthy homes, slaves served as cooks, cleaners, tutors, and even doctors. The slave markets were a regular part of Roman commercial life. People would be bought and sold like livestock, their prices depending on their skills, their strength, their appearance. Educated Greek slave, who could teach literature, might cost far more than a strong young man, destined for farm work. Yet, even in this harsh system, there were glimmers of hope. Roman law allowed slaves to earn or buy their freedom, and freed slaves, called freedmen, could even become Roman citizens. They couldn't hold high political office, but they could work, trade, and build lives for themselves and their children. The Romans had a fascinating way of thinking about success and social standing. They didn't simply worship wealth the way some societies do. Instead, they prized something they called dignitas, a concept that's hard to translate but meant something like honor, prestige, and reputation all mixed together. You could be rich but have no dignitas if you'd earned your money, in ways that Romans considered shameful. But you could also be relatively poor and still command enormous respect if you'd served your city well. Military service was one sure way to build dignitas, especially if you'd commanded troops successfully or shown exceptional courage in battle. Holding public office was another path to dignitas, and wealthy Romans would often spend enormous sums of their own money to win elections and then to fulfill their duties in style. They'd sponsor public games, pay for new buildings, or fund festivals that the entire city could enjoy. When it came to entertainment, Romans had an appetite for spectacle that was truly breathtaking. The Colosseum, that massive oval amphitheater that still dominates Rome's skyline today, could hold more than 50,000 people. On game days, it would fill with Romans from every social class, all gathered to watch gladiators fight for their lives. These gladiatorial contests weren't just random violence. They were carefully choreographed events with their own rules, traditions, and even celebrities. Some gladiators became so famous that people would travel hundreds of miles just to see them fight. They were the sports stars of their day, admired and cheered Even though most of them were slaves or condemned criminals, the games were expensive to put on, requiring months of preparation and enormous amounts of money. But wealthy Romans, especially those seeking political office, would sponsor them anyway. It was a way of showing both their wealth and their generosity to the common people, whose votes they needed. Romans also loved theatre, though their tastes ran more toward comedy and spectacle than the serious dramas that Greeks preferred. Plays would be performed at religious festivals, with elaborate costumes and masks. The actors were usually slaves or freedmen, since patricians considered acting beneath their dignity. Religion touched every aspect of Roman life, like water seeping into every crack of a stone wall. The Romans worshipped dozens of gods and goddesses, each with their own personalities, preferences, and areas of responsibility. Jupiter was the king of the gods, wielding thunderbolts from his throne in the heavens. Mars governed war and courage, while Venus ruled love and beauty. But Roman religion wasn't just about the great gods. Every household had its own protected spirits, every neighborhood its local deities, every trade its patron god. Before starting any important undertaking, Romans would seek the favor of the appropriate gods through sacrifices, prayers, and ritual ceremonies. Religious festivals dotted the Roman calendar like jewels on a necklace. Some honored specific gods, others marked the changing seasons or commemorated great victories from Rome's past. These festivals were community events, bringing together people from all walks of life to share in the rituals, the feasting, and the sense of connection to something greater than themselves. Education was the key that could unlock doors in Roman society, especially for those not born into the patrician class. Wealthy families would hire the best tutors they could find, often Greek slaves who were considered the most learned teachers available. These tutors would teach not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also rhetoric, the art of public speaking that was essential for anyone who wanted to succeed in politics or law. Roman education wasn't just about cramming facts into young minds. It was about shaping character, instilling values, and preparing the next generation to carry on Rome's traditions. Students would memorize long passages from great poets and orators, learning not just what to think, but how to think. For girls, education was more limited, but not entirely absent. Patrician daughters might learn to read and write, to manage household accounts, and to appreciate literature and music. Some women became quite learned, though they were generally expected to use their education to better manage their homes and raise their children rather than to pursue public careers. The Roman world was one of sharp contrasts and surprising opportunities. A person's birth determined much, but not everything. Courage, cleverness, and determination could still change a life's trajectory. The city itself reflected these contradictions, with marble palaces standing not far from crowded tenements, with the sounds of philosophical debates mixing with the cries of street vendors. What made Rome work, despite all its inequalities and tensions, was a shared sense of identity and purpose. Romans believed deeply in their city's destiny, in its right to rule the world, and in the values that had made that rule possible. This belief gave meaning to the sacrifices of soldiers, the labor of workers, and the service of officials. Picture the ancient world, where power and status flowed like rivers through society, carving deep channels that would shape countless lives. The Roman Empire stood as perhaps history's most fascinating example of how humans organized themselves, creating layers upon layers of social meaning that would echo through the centuries. At the very pinnacle of this world lived the patricians, those blessed few who traced their bloodlines back to Rome's misty beginnings. These families carried names that whispered of ancient privilege, descendants of the very first senators that Romulus himself had supposedly chosen when Rome was nothing more than a collection of hills beside the Tiber. Imagine inheriting not just wealth, but the exclusive right to hold the empire's most powerful positions, the consulship and the censorship, roles that could shape the fate of millions. Their riches came from vast estates called latifundia, sprawling agricultural operations that stretched across the countryside like green seas. These weren't simple farms, but complex economic engines worked by countless hands. slave labor and tenant farmers who tilled the soil that fed the empire's appetite. The patricians lived in a world where political power and landed wealth danced together in an endless waltz. Just beneath them, though, existed a class that would challenge the very notion that birth determined destiny. The equestrians began as something beautifully practical, men wealthy enough to afford their own horses for military service. But as Rome grew and commerce flourished, these mounted warriors transformed into something entirely different, a business class that understood money's true power. They collected taxes across the empire's far-flung provinces, negotiated public contracts, and slowly discovered that economic influence could sometimes matter more than ancient bloodlines. The equestrians lived in that fascinating space between old aristocracy and new money, proving that in Rome, change was always possible, even within rigid traditions. Their rise tells us something profound about human societies, how they adapt and shift even when they appear carved in stone. Then there were the plebeians, the vast majority who made Rome actually function. Picture the artisans in their workshops, fingers stained with dye or clay, creating the objects that filled Roman homes. Think of merchants haggling in busy marketplaces, their voices mixing with a dozen languages as goods from across the known world changed hands. Farmers worked smaller plots, feeding their families and the city's endless hunger, while laborers built the roads and aqueducts that still inspire wonder today. The plebeians' story is perhaps the most remarkable of all, because they refused to accept powerlessness as their permanent condition. Through collective action that historians call the conflict of the orders, they gradually forced concessions from the aristocracy. They won the right to hold the consulship, established tribunes to protect their interests, and proved that even in ancient times, ordinary people could reshape their world when they stood together. At society's bottom existed a reality that modern minds struggle to fully comprehend. Slavery permeated Roman life, but it operated by rules very different from what later centuries would know. Race played no role in determining who became enslaved. Instead, it was war, crime, or debt that could transform a free person into someone else's property overnight. This randomness must have haunted the ancient world, knowing that circumstance alone separated the free from the enslaved. Yet even here, Rome offered something unusual, the genuine possibility of freedom. Former slaves, called freedmen, could purchase or earn their liberty, then rebuild their lives as Roman citizens, though they never quite escaped the shadow of their past. Some freedmen accumulated enormous wealth and influence, becoming living proof of Rome's strange combination of rigid hierarchy and unexpected opportunity. Women in Roman society occupied their own complex position, enjoying freedoms that would have seemed impossible in many ancient cultures. They could own property, conduct business, even initiate divorce proceedings. Picture a Roman matron managing her household's finances or negotiating a business deal in the Forum, exercising an independence that wouldn't return to European women for many centuries. Yet the public sphere, voting and political office, remained forever closed to them, creating a world where private power and public exclusion existed side by side. Perhaps most remarkably, the Roman Empire became a vast melting pot of cultures, languages, and beliefs. As legions conquered new territories, they didn't just impose Roman ways, they absorbed and adapted local customs in return. Walk through any Roman city at the empire's height, and you'd hear a symphony of languages, smell spices from distant lands, see temples to gods whose names originated in Egypt, Germany, or Persia. This cultural mixing created something entirely new, a civilization that was Roman yet thoroughly international. Social mobility, while never easy, remained genuinely possible in ways that would have seemed miraculous to most ancient peoples. A plebeian with talent and luck might accumulate enough wealth to join the equestrian class. A freed slave could become a successful merchant, whose children would grow up as full Roman citizens. An equestrian who met the property requirements could even enter the Senate, that most exclusive of institutions. These transformations were rare, like finding precious gems, but they happened often enough to keep the dream of advancement alive. This complex system created a society that was simultaneously oppressive and liberating, rigid yet flexible, traditional yet constantly evolving. It reminds us that human civilizations are never simple things, but rather intricate tapestries woven from countless individual stories, dreams, and struggles. The Roman Empire's social structure endured for centuries precisely because it managed to balance stability with just enough opportunity for change to prevent complete stagnation. In the end, Roman society reveals something timeless about how we organize ourselves as humans, how we create meaning through hierarchy while still leaving room for the unexpected, the ambitious, the fortunate to rise above their circumstances and write new chapters in civilization's endless story. When the sun began to sink behind Rome's 7 hills, something magical would happen. The ancient city would slowly come alive in ways that modern people might find surprisingly familiar. Workers would pack up their tools, shopkeepers would close their doors, and the real social life of Rome would finally begin. Picture this, if you will. Narrow cobblestone streets, suddenly filled with the warm glow of oil lamps, the smell of food drifting from countless taverns, and most impressive of all, the grand bathhouses lighting up like ancient shopping malls. These weren't just places to get clean, mind you, they were the heart of Roman social life. Take the famous baths of Caracalla. Built way back in the 3rd century, this place was absolutely massive. Imagine a building that could hold thousands of people at once. Libraries, gardens, gymnasiums, massage rooms. It was like a modern spa resort, mixed with a community center, all rolled into one incredible structure. The bathing ritual itself tells us so much about Roman culture. First, you'd undress in the changing room, just like at any modern gym. Wooden lockers lined the walls, and attendants would keep an eye on your belongings. Then came the real experience. You'd start in the tepidarium, a pleasantly warm room. Not too hot, just enough to get your body ready. Romans believed this gradual process was key. Then, off to the caldarium, where the heat would really hit you. Steam everywhere, people chatting, politics being discussed. Finally, the shock of the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool that would snap your pores shut and leave you feeling absolutely refreshed. What's fascinating is who you might bump into. Senators chatting with merchants, poets arguing with soldiers, gladiators relaxing next to wealthy landowners. Roman society, for all its problems, had these amazing moments where different classes would mingle. Of course, slaves would be there too, working as attendants, but still, it was more mixing than you'd see in many other ancient civilizations. After the baths, if you were lucky enough to be invited, you might head to a dinner party. Roman banquets were absolutely legendary. Picture this scene: guests reclining on couches, not sitting in chairs. Professional servers bringing course after course, and the food. Well, let's just say Romans had some interesting tastes. Roasted peacock, stuffed with exotic spices. Dormice, yes, those little rodents prepared as delicacies. Garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything. Kind of like how we use ketchup today. The wealthier your host, the more outrageous the menu became. Some emperors supposedly spent fortunes on single meals. Entertainment was just as elaborate. Musicians would play, poets would recite their latest works, and acrobats might perform between courses. These weren't just dinner parties, they were full theatrical productions. Romans loved spectacle, they loved showing off, and they definitely loved impressing their guests. But here's where the story gets complicated. While some Romans were living like this, enjoying luxury most of us can barely imagine, millions of others were struggling to survive. The contrast was absolutely staggering. Poor Romans lived in buildings called insulae, basically ancient apartment blocks. These structures were notoriously dangerous. Built quickly, with cheap materials, they'd collapse without warning. Fires were a constant threat, and if you lived on the upper floors, which most poor people did, you wouldn't have running water. Imagine carrying water up 5 flights of stairs. every single day. The inequality went even deeper than that. The Roman Empire was built on slavery. Millions of people treated as property, doing every kind of work imaginable. Field labor, household service, even skilled jobs like tutoring or accounting. Some slaves, particularly educated Greeks, lived relatively comfortable lives. But most faced brutal conditions with little hope. Occasionally, a slave might earn their freedom through manumission. Sometimes masters would free slaves in their wills, sometimes as a reward for faithful service. But for most slaves, freedom remained just a distant dream. Yet somehow, despite all this inequality, the Roman system worked for centuries. Their government, though far from perfect, provided stability across vast territories. Their legal system influenced laws that we still use today. And their engineering, well, that was simply incredible. Roman roads stretched across 3 continents, built so well that many are still in use. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities hundreds of miles away. And their architecture, the dome of the Pantheon, the massive Colosseum, these weren't just impressive, they were revolutionary. Romans invented concrete, perfected the arch, and created building techniques that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Walking through Rome today, you're still seeing their incredible craftsmanship everywhere. Their cultural achievements were equally impressive. Poets like Virgil wrote epics that students still read today. Roman historians documented their world with remarkable detail. Even everyday objects, pottery, jewelry, household items, were crafted with an attention to beauty that shows how much Romans valued artistic excellence. This fascinating contradiction, luxury alongside poverty, innovation alongside brutality, makes Roman society endlessly intriguing. It was a civilization that could build magnificent temples while treating millions as property, that could create beautiful poetry while enjoying gladiatorial combat. Perhaps that's why, even today, we remain so fascinated by ancient Rome. It shows us both the heights humans can reach and the depths we can sink to. The grandeur and the darkness existing side by side in one of history's most powerful empires. Roman influence never really disappeared. Our architecture borrows Roman elements. Our legal systems trace back to Roman law. Languages across Europe evolved from Latin. Even our calendar comes from Roman innovations. So when you walk past a government building with its columns and dome, when you use words that trace back to Latin, when you think about concepts like citizenship and civic duty, you're experiencing echoes of that ancient world. Rome fell, but in many ways it never really went away. Picture Rome in the golden hours of morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the 7 hills. The city stirred to life with a rhythm all its own, measured not by our rigid clocks, but by something far more natural, and perhaps more wise. Time itself moved differently back then, stretching and shrinking like a living thing. A Roman hour wasn't our 60-minute block, carved in stone. No, their hours breathed with the seasons, longer in summer's embrace, shorter when winter held the world. 12 hours filled each day, from sunrise to sunset, but these hours danced to nature's tune, not mathematics. The morning light brought with it the gentle ritual of the first meal. Bread, still warm perhaps, paired with cheese that had aged in cool cellars. Sometimes olives, dark and rich, or fruits dried by Mediterranean sun. Simple foods, but there's something profound in starting the day with such elemental sustenance, isn't there? But morning held different meanings for different people. The wealthy patricians, draped in their fine togas, would soon receive their morning visitors. This wasn't mere socializing, mind you. It was the beating heart of Roman society, the salutio, where networks of loyalty and mutual benefit played out each dawn. Imagine the scene, if you will. Lesser citizens, the clients, arriving at grand doorsteps, offering their respect, their services, their very allegiance. In return, protection flowed downward, aid when needed, a place in the great web of Roman society. It was a dance as old as civilization itself, this exchange of service for security. Meanwhile, across the city, in humbler quarters, the common people, the plebeians, prepared for their own day's journey. Their bread might be coarser, their cheese simpler, but they too partook in Rome's great daily awakening. Off they went. To fields that fed the empire, to workshops where skilled hands shaped the goods that filled Roman markets, to the homes of the wealthy where they kept the machinery of privilege running smoothly. The markets were something to behold. Picture the Forum Boarium, alive with the lowing of cattle, or the smaller neighborhood markets, where vendors called out their wares like ancient songs, fruits piled high in perfect pyramids, fish, glistening silver, on beds of ice brought down from mountain peaks, fabrics dyed in colors that caught the eye like jewels. Here, in these bustling spaces, all of Rome converged. Rich and poor, citizen and slave, local and foreigner, all drawn together by the simple human need to trade, to bargain, to find what they required for their daily existence. The air filled with a symphony of voices, haggling in Latin, laughing, arguing, making the deals that kept an empire fed and clothed. As the sun climbed higher, painting shadows shorter on marble steps, midday brought its own pause, the prandium, a brief respite from the day's labors. Nothing elaborate, mind you. The Mediterranean heat demanded restraint, cold meats perhaps, bread again, maybe some wine mixed with water to ease the throat. This midday meal tells us something beautiful about Roman wisdom. They understood that the body needed rest, that even in an empire built on ambition and conquest, there was time for the simple act of nourishment, of sitting quietly while the world blazed hot around them. The afternoon hours stretched long, filled with the serious business of civilization. For those blessed with wealth and status, this meant the weighty matters of politics, the careful management of vast estates that sprawled across conquered territories, or the pursuit of knowledge in philosophy and literature that would echo through centuries. But for the many, afternoon meant the continuation of honest labor. Farmers bent over crops that would become bread on tomorrow's tables. Craftsmen shaped clay into vessels, hammered metal into tools, wove threads into cloth. Servants moved through cool corridors of patrician homes, maintaining the comfort that wealth demanded. Then came one of Rome's greatest gifts to civilization, though we rarely think of it this way. Around mid-afternoon, when work's urgency began to fade, Romans made their way to the public baths. These weren't simply places to wash away the day's grime, though they served that purpose too. No, the baths were something far grander, far more essential to the Roman soul. They were democracy made manifest in marble and steam. Here, class distinctions softened in the democratic equality of naked bodies seeking the same simple pleasure of hot water and companionship. Picture these architectural marvels, if you can. Vast spaces where engineering genius created environments of pure luxury. Hot pools that warmed bones tired from labor, cold plunges that shocked the system back to alertness, steam rooms where conversation flowed as freely as the heated air, and gymnasiums where Romans exercised not just their bodies, but their minds through discourse with friends and strangers alike. Business was conducted here too, deals struck between men relaxing in therapeutic waters, friendships forged in the universal vulnerability of the bath. It was civilization, at its most refined, this understanding that cleanliness and community were not luxuries, but necessities of a life well lived. Evening brought the day's crescendo, the cena, the main meal that gathered families and friends around tables rich or simple, depending on fortune's favor. For Rome's elite, this Baian theatre, a display of wealth that could boggle the mind. Multiple courses paraded from kitchen to dining room, exotic delicacies that spoke of an empire's reach, oysters from distant shores, peacock tongues that represented the height of culinary extravagance, wines from vineyards that stretched across conquered lands. These weren't merely meals, they were statements, declarations of power, written in food and drink. But across the city, in countless modest homes, the cena told different stories no less meaningful for their simplicity. Grain dishes that sustained life without fanfare, vegetables grown in small gardens, occasionally meat or fish when fortune smiled. These meals, shared around humble tables, carried their own dignity, their own essential role in the great tapestry of Roman life. The day's final act was, perhaps its most human, the commissatio, the drinking party that marked evening's arrival. Wine flowed, but more than that, conversation flowed. Laughter echoed off walls both grand and simple. Games were played, music filled the air. Performers entertained with stories and songs that carried the day's experiences into the realm of art. The wealthy hosted elaborate gatherings in homes decorated with frescoes and mosaics, while common folk gathered in neighborhood taverns. The Popina, where wine was cheaper but companionship just as genuine. Here, in these final hours before sleep, Romans of all stations found what humans have always sought: connection with their fellow beings, the simple pleasure of shared experience. As darkness settled over the eternal city, as oil lamps flickered to life in windows across 7 hills, the rhythm of the dies completed itself once more. Tomorrow would bring the same cycle, sunrise to sunset, work and rest, solitude and community, all measured not by mechanical precision, but by the eternal dance of light and shadow that governed human existence long before clocks began, their tyrannical ticking. There's something deeply moving about this ancient rhythm, isn't there? This understanding that time should serve life, not dominate it. That a day well lived included work and rest, solitude and community, the practical and the pleasurable all woven together, in proportions that honored both necessity and the human spirit's need for something more than mere survival. Picture yourself standing in the heart of ancient Rome, during those golden centuries when the empire stretched from Britain to the deserts of Africa. The morning air carries something magical, the scent of fresh bread mixing with incense from nearby temples, while the gentle clatter of wooden wheels on stone streets create a rhythm that feels almost like a lullaby. Rome wasn't just a city, it was a living, breathing symbol of human achievement. People traveled from the farthest corners of the known world, drawn by stories of marble columns that touched the sky and streets paved with opportunity. This wasn't merely about geography, it was about belonging to something greater than yourself, something that promised to last forever. The Roman people understood that knowledge was power. Long before anyone coined that phrase, wealthy families would hire private tutors, often Greek scholars who brought wisdom from across the Mediterranean. These teachers would guide young minds through the mysteries of rhetoric, the beauty of philosophy, and the practical arts of mathematics. In special schools called ludus, children learnt not just with their minds, but with their bodies too, understanding that a strong spirit needed both sharp thinking and physical grace. For those born into simpler circumstances, education came through different paths. A blacksmith's son would learn the secrets of metal and fire, watching his father's hands shape iron into tools that could build an empire. A baker's daughter might discover the alchemy of grain and yeast, creating sustenance that fed the masses. These weren't lesser forms of learning, they were the foundation stones upon which Roman greatness rested. The Romans had discovered something profound about human nature, that people need both work and play to truly flourish. Their public baths weren't just places to get clean, they were temples of relaxation, where a senator might find himself discussing philosophy with a successful merchant. The warm waters dissolved social barriers, creating conversations that might never happen in the formal world outside. When Romans wanted spectacle, they created something the world had never seen before. The great amphitheaters weren't just buildings, they were stages where human drama played out in its most intense forms. Gladiators became heroes, their stories whispered in taverns and celebrated in songs. These weren't mere entertainments, they were expressions of Roman values, courage, skill, and the belief that facing death with dignity could transform an ordinary person into something legendary. Food tells us so much about how people really lived. The average Roman family gathered around simple meals that would feel familiar to us today. Bread still warm from neighborhood ovens, olive oil that carried the taste of Mediterranean sunshine, wine that turned an ordinary evening into something worth remembering. The wealthy might feast on delicacies brought from distant provinces, but even the simplest Roman meal carried flavors of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Perhaps most remarkably, the Romans created something that still shapes our world today, a system of laws that recognized both justice and mercy. Their legal principles weren't just rules carved in stone, they were living ideas that could adapt and grow. A Roman judge understood that true justice required wisdom, not just the mechanical application of rules. These legal concepts would outlive the empire itself, becoming the foundation for legal systems across the modern world. The spiritual life of Romans reveals something beautiful about human nature. They didn't worship distant, unknowable gods, but deities who felt like family members with very human personalities. Jupiter might throw thunderbolts when angry, but he could also be generous and protective. Venus brought love and beauty into daily life, while Mars reminded everyone that sometimes you had to fight for what mattered. These weren't abstract theological concepts, they were relationships that made the universe feel personal and meaningful. Roman society had its layers, like a beautiful but complex piece of music. The patricians lived in houses with gardens and fountains, their days filled with political discussions and literary pursuits. The equestrians, Rome's middle class, built businesses that connected the empire's far corners, creating wealth through innovation and hard work. And the common people, the true heroes of Roman civilization, crafted the goods, grew the food, and performed the countless daily tasks that kept this magnificent machine running smoothly. What made Roman civilization so enduring wasn't its military might or territorial expansion, though both were impressive. It was the Romans' genius for bringing different peoples together, for creating systems that could adapt and survive, and for understanding that true greatness comes from building something larger than any individual life. Walking through ancient Rome, at its peak, would have felt like stepping into humanity's greatest experiment, a place where different cultures, ideas, and dreams came together to create something entirely new. The echoes of those cobblestone streets still reach us today, in our laws, our languages, our very ideas about what civilization can become. As you let these images of ancient Rome drift through your mind, remember that you're not just learning about the past, you're connecting with the long human story of which we're all a part. Imagine a world where power flowed through carefully balanced channels, where one person held ultimate authority, yet ancient traditions still whispered their influence through marble halls. The Roman Empire, at its most magnificent height, created something the world had never seen before. It was neither pure monarchy nor democracy, but something entirely different, something that defied the simple categories that other civilizations understood. The emperor sat at the center of this vast machine, wielding power that stretched across continents. Yet beside him, in their togas and formal dignity, the senators continued their ancient debates. These weren't just ceremonial figures, mind you. They carried real weight, real influence, the living remnants of the old republic that Rome once was. Picture them. These aristocrats who had inherited positions of tremendous responsibility, appointed for life by the very emperor they sometimes dared to advise against. What's remarkable is how this system worked at all. The Senate controlled the purse strings, decided which laws would govern millions of people, and dispensed justice across the known world. They were, in a sense, the memory of Rome, the keepers of traditions that stretched back centuries before any emperor had claimed divine authority. When misconduct occurred, even these powerful men could find themselves stripped of everything, cast out from the marble corridors where they had once walked with such confidence. But Rome's true genius revealed itself not in debate halls or political maneuvering. It showed in the disciplined ranks of soldiers who carried the eagle standards across 3 continents. These weren't just armies, they were something closer to perfectly tuned instruments of conquest. 5,000 men formed the legion, and within each legion, smaller groups of about 100 soldiers followed their centurions into battle after battle. The beauty of the Roman military lay in its fairness, strange as that might sound. A farmer's son could rise to command thousands if he showed courage and skill. Birth meant little compared to competence on the battlefield. This was revolutionary thinking, This idea that merit could triumph over bloodlines, that a common soldier might one day wear the decorations of high command. Roman ingenuity extended far beyond military organization, though. They created weapons that seemed almost clever in their design. The pilum, their special spear, would bend when it struck an enemy shield, making it impossible to pull out or throw back. Imagine the frustration of warriors who found their shields suddenly useless, weighted down by bent spears they couldn't remove. It was psychological warfare, disguised as simple engineering. Even more impressive were the roads these armies traveled, the bridges they crossed. Roman engineers didn't just build paths through the wilderness. They created highways that lasted centuries, stone foundations that supported not just marching legions, but the commerce and communication that held an empire together. Every mile marker represented another step in Rome's patient conquest of distance itself. Yet Rome was never content to be merely a military power. Something deeper drove this civilization, a hunger for beauty and knowledge that expressed itself in ways that still take our breath away today. Emperors competed not just in conquest but in creation, commissioning buildings that defied the limits of stone and mortar. The Colosseum rose like a monument to human ambition. The Pantheon challenged the very sky with its perfect dome, and the great baths offered luxury that common citizens in other empires could never have imagined. Literature flourished in this environment like flowers in fertile soil. Poets crafted verses that captured the Roman soul. Philosophers wrote treatises that still influence how we think about life and death, wisdom and folly. The Stoics, in particular, offered something precious to a civilization built on conquest and competition. They taught that true strength came from within, that external circumstances, whether triumph or disaster, need not disturb the inner peace of a wise person. This philosophy wasn't just academic theory. It shaped how Romans approached everything from politics to personal relationships. The idea that one should maintain tranquility regardless of what fortune might bring became woven into the fabric of Roman character, at least among those who embraced these teachings. Perhaps nowhere did Roman sophistication show more clearly than in their approach to law. They created something unprecedented, a legal system based not on the whims of rulers or the traditions of tribes, but on principles of justice that could be applied consistently across vast distances and diverse populations. These weren't just rules, they were the foundation stones of civilization itself, concepts so enduring that they still support legal systems around the world today. But even as we admire Rome's achievements, we cannot ignore the shadows that fell across this magnificent civilization. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, while countless others struggled in poverty. Slavery sustained the economy, a brutal reality that contradicted the noble ideals Roman philosophers preached about human dignity and worth. These contradictions remind us that even the greatest civilizations remain human creations, flawed and complex, capable of both breathtaking beauty and heartbreaking cruelty. Rome succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it found ways to balance competing forces, to create stability within complexity, to build something larger and more lasting than any individual life. As night settles around you, let your mind wander through those ancient streets, past the vendors calling their wares, the citizens gathered around fountains, discussing the news of the day. Feel the weight of history in those stone buildings. Hear the echo of debates that shaped the future. Sense the presence of countless lives that contributed to something greater than themselves. The Roman Empire, in all its contradictions and complexities, achieved something that continues to fascinate us across the centuries. It showed that human beings, working together despite their differences and limitations, could create beauty that endures, systems of justice that inspire, and legacies that illuminate the path forward for generations yet to come. Picture this, if you will, a world where the Mediterranean Sea earned itself a rather proud nickname, the Roman Lake. Ships would drift across these waters, carrying treasures from every corner of the known world. Egyptian grain filled massive cargo holds, while precious spices from distant eastern lands perfumed the air around busy harbors. Even tin from the misty shores of Britain found its way into Roman hands. These vessels would arrive at ports that never seemed to sleep, Rome's markets buzzed with an energy that's hard to imagine today. Merchants would call out their wares, voices mixing together like some ancient symphony of commerce. You could find pottery that gleamed in the sunlight, textiles woven with patterns that told stories of far-off places, and metalwork so fine it seemed almost magical. The whole system rested on something much simpler though, something that grew quietly in the rich soil of the Italian peninsula. Agriculture formed the beating heart of everything Roman. The Mediterranean climate seemed custom-made for growing things. Warm summers and mild winters created perfect conditions for crops that would feed an empire. Wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see, golden waves that rustled in gentle breezes. These weren't just pretty landscapes though, they represented survival itself for millions of people. The grain that grew here didn't just feed local families, it traveled across continents, sustaining Roman soldiers on distant campaigns and feeding crowded cities that might otherwise have starved. But wheat wasn't the only star of this agricultural show. Vineyards climbed hillsides in neat rows, their grapes destined to become wine that would flow at dinner tables from Britain to Egypt. Olive groves dotted the countryside too, their silvery green leaves catching sunlight while producing oil that served as everything from cooking ingredient to lamp fuel. The fascinating thing about Roman farming was how it touched every level of society. Wealthy patricians owned estates so vast they were almost like small kingdoms. These weren't just investments though, they were symbols of power and status. Meanwhile, common plebeians worked the soil with their own hands, their lives tied to the rhythms of planting and harvest. This agricultural abundance created something remarkable, a surplus that allowed Rome to dream bigger than any civilization before it. When you can feed your people reliably, you can afford to send young men off to become soldiers. When your granaries are full, you can support artists and architects and philosophers who don't grow their own food. The wealth that flowed through Roman hands came from another source too, one that's uncomfortable to think about but impossible to ignore. Slavery formed a dark foundation beneath all this prosperity. Human beings, bought and sold like any other commodity, provided the labor that kept the whole system running. These enslaved people worked everywhere. They tended the very wheat fields we just imagined, their backs bent under the Mediterranean sun. They crafted the beautiful pottery and textiles that filled those bustling markets. In wealthy Roman homes, they cooked meals, taught children, and managed entire households. The harsh reality is that Roman prosperity was built on their unpaid labor. The treatment these people received varied wildly. Some skilled slaves might earn a kind of respect, even eventual freedom. Others faced lives of grinding hardship that ended too soon. Their stories remind us that even the most impressive civilizations can rest on foundations that trouble the conscience. Rome's economic success created its own problems too. Imagine trying to manage money across 3 continents with ancient technology. The constant wars that expanded Roman territory cost enormous amounts of gold and silver. To pay for these campaigns, emperors sometimes mixed cheaper metals into their coins, making each one worth less than before. This created a cycle that sounds familiar even today. Prices would rise as the currency lost value. Common people found their savings buying less and less. Meanwhile, the wealthy, who owned land and goods that held their value, grew even richer. The gap between rich and poor stretched wider and wider, like a crack in a foundation that would eventually bring the whole structure down. Local craftsmen added their own threads to this complex economic tapestry. In workshops scattered throughout Roman cities, skilled hands shaped clay into vessels, wove fibers into cloth, and hammered metal into tools and decorations. These weren't just local businesses either. Roman pottery has been found in places so distant, it seems almost impossible that ancient merchants could have carried it there. The roads that connected this vast empire deserve their own moment of wonder. Roman engineers built pathways so well constructed that some still carry traffic today. 2,000 years later, these weren't just impressive engineering projects though, they were the arteries through which economic life flowed. Merchants could travel from Spain to Syria, knowing they'd find well-maintained roads and safe passage. This network created something unprecedented in human history. For the first time, goods and ideas could move freely across such enormous distances. A family in Britain might eat grain grown in Egypt while using pottery made in Gaul. The world had never seen anything like this interconnected economy. The organizational skills required to manage all this trade was staggering. Roman administrators kept track of shipments, taxes, and inventory across 3 continents, using nothing more than papyrus, ink, and human memory. They created systems that allowed a merchant in Alexandria to do business with someone in distant Germania, trusting that contracts would be honored and payments made. All of this economic activity created a kind of cultural mixing too. Languages blended as traders learned enough of each other's tongues to negotiate deals. Cooking styles spread as new ingredients became available in distant markets. Art and music carried influences from one end of the empire to the other. The Roman economy wasn't perfect, but it achieved something remarkable. It showed that human beings could organize themselves on a truly massive scale, creating prosperity that reached across the known world. The echoes of Roman economic principles still influence how we think about trade, currency, and markets today. Picture ancient Rome at its absolute peak, when the city hummed with creative energy like no other place on earth. Artists traveled from the farthest corners of the empire, drawn by opportunity and the promise of greatness. Writers found patrons among the wealthy, and performers discovered audiences hungry for entertainment. The Romans possessed an almost magical ability to transform simple stories into grand spectacles. Their love for theatre ran deep, threading through every level of society. Imagine walking through Rome on any given evening, hearing laughter spill from temporary stages erected just for a festival. These weren't the permanent stone theatres we might expect, but wooden platforms that appeared overnight, as if summoned by the collective desire for storytelling. The first parexib to wooden platforms that appeared overnight. The actors who brought these stories to life lived fascinating double lives. Many were slaves or former slaves, yet on stage they became gods, heroes, and kings. They wore masks crafted with such exaggerated features that audiences could read emotions from the very back rows. These masks weren't just practical tools, they were windows into different souls. Then there was pantomime, an art form that sounds simple but required incredible skill. A single dancer would tell entire epic stories using only movement, while voices around them provided the words. Imagine watching someone convey the fall of Troy or the adventures of Odysseus using nothing but their body. Every gesture, carefully choreographed to pull at your heartstrings. But Romans craved more than gentle entertainment. They hungered for spectacle on a scale that would make our modern events seem modest. The gladiatorial games satisfied this appetite in ways that still capture our imagination today. These weren't just fights. They were elaborate productions that showcased Rome's wealth and power to anyone watching. The gladiators themselves lived in a strange world between celebrity and slavery. Most began as condemned criminals or captured enemies. Yet the greatest among them could achieve fame that echoed through the empire. People would cheer their names, bet on their victories, and mourn their defeats. Some gladiators earned enough money and respect to buy their freedom, transforming from society's lowest members into its most celebrated figures. These games took place in amphitheaters that dotted the landscape like jewels. Each one represented not just entertainment, but civic pride. Local officials would sponsor increasingly elaborate events, featuring everything from chariot races that thundered around tight turns to exotic animal hunts that brought distant lands into Roman hearts. Music wove through Roman life like a golden thread, appearing in temples during solemn religious ceremonies and bursting forth during joyful public celebrations. The Romans embraced a wonderful variety of instruments. The lyre produced gentle, contemplative melodies perfect for intimate gatherings. Flutes added sweetness to outdoor festivals, and the tuba, that long trumpet-like instrument, could announce important events with sounds that carried across entire city districts. Romans understood that many poems were meant to be sung rather than simply recited. They developed their own system for writing down music. though time has claimed most of these precious records. What remains hints at a sophisticated musical culture that valued both technical skill and emotional expression. In visual arts, Romans possessed an almost obsessive love for capturing reality exactly as they saw it. Their sculptors created portraits so lifelike that you half expect the marble figures to draw breath and speak. Every wrinkle, every expression line, every subtle detail was preserved with stunning accuracy. Their mosaics and frescoes turned walls and floors into storytelling surfaces. A Roman dining room might feature scenes from daily life, while a public building could display mythological adventures or historical victories. These weren't just decorations, they were windows into how Romans saw themselves and their world. Literature flourished during this golden age like flowers after spring rain. Poets such as Virgil crafted verses that still move readers today, weaving together history, mythology, and human emotion into timeless stories. Ovid explored themes of love and transformation that feel remarkably modern. Historians like Tacitus and Livy preserved the empire's story for future generations, while philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius pondered life's deepest questions. These writers understood that literature should both entertain and educate. They created works that could be enjoyed by common citizens, while also challenging the most sophisticated minds. Their influence spread far beyond Rome's borders, shaping how people thought about storytelling, history, and human nature for centuries to come. Education held sacred importance in Roman society, viewed as the foundation upon which civilization rested. Children learned reading and writing as essential life skills, but their studies extended far beyond basic literacy. Mathematics prepared them for commerce and engineering. Music developed their artistic sensibilities. Philosophy taught them how to think clearly about complex problems. Roman educators believed that learning should shape character, as well as mind. They wanted students who could contribute meaningfully to society, while embodying Roman values of duty, honor, and civic responsibility. Education wasn't just about acquiring knowledge, it was about becoming worthy citizens of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Yet beneath this cultural brilliance lay stark realities that remind us how different ancient life could be. Roman society resembled a steep pyramid, with enormous gaps between rich and poor. Wealthy families enjoyed luxuries that would impress us today, while countless others struggled with conditions we can barely imagine. Slavery formed an uncomfortable foundation beneath Roman achievements. Many of the artists, performers, and skilled workers who created such beauty were not free to choose their own paths. This contradiction between cultural refinement and human bondage reveals the complex moral landscape that Romans navigated daily. Still, for those who found ways to succeed within this system, opportunities existed that could transform entire family lines. A talented gladiator might win freedom and fortune. A gifted writer could gain powerful patrons. A skilled craftsman could establish workshops that prospered for generations. These glimpses into Roman cultural life reveal a civilization that understood how to balance grand ambitions with human-scaled pleasures. They built an empire that lasted centuries, but they also knew how to laugh at comedies, cheer for their favorite performers, and lose themselves in beautiful music on quiet evenings. Picture yourself walking through an ancient Roman street, where the air is thick with the scent of exotic spices and the chatter of dozens of languages. The Roman Empire, at its height, was like a massive web, connecting distant lands and bringing together people who might never have met otherwise. It's remarkable, really, how a single civilization managed to weave together so many different threads of humanity into one enormous tapestry. The Romans had this fascinating way of living that tells us so much about what they valued. Take their homes, for instance. The wealthy Romans lived in these sprawling houses called domus, which were like little worlds unto themselves. Right at the heart of each home sat the atrium, this beautiful open courtyard where sunlight would dance across the floors throughout the day. They'd place a shallow basin there, called an impluvium, to catch rainwater as it fell from the sky. It's almost poetic, isn't it? How they made something as simple as collecting water into an art form. But here's where the story gets interesting and a bit sad too. While the rich enjoyed these palace-like homes with their intricate mosaics and stunning frescoes, most Romans lived in towering apartment buildings called insulae. These structures could reach 6 or 7 stories high, creaking and swaying in the wind like ancient skyscrapers. The clever Romans figured out something that we still see today. The higher up you lived, the cheaper your rent, but also the more dangerous your life became. The wealthy claimed the sturdy ground floors, while the poor climbed endless stairs to their cramped quarters near the clouds. Now let's talk about what filled Roman stomachs, because food tells such beautiful stories about a culture. Wheat was their foundation, ground into flour and baked into the bread that sustained millions of lives. They understood something profound about the Mediterranean climate, how it could gift them with olives and grapes, vegetables and legumes that burst with flavor under that golden sun. Meat was precious, reserved for special moments and wealthy tables, making each bite a celebration. The Romans had this extraordinary ingredient called garum, a fermented fish sauce that they used the way we might use salt or ketchup today. Imagine entire towns dedicated to producing this pungent sauce, the smell so overpowering that the factories had to be built far from where people lived. It's one of those details that makes you realize how similar we are to people who lived 2,000 years ago, finding ways to make our food taste better, even if it meant dealing with some rather unpleasant odors. Clothing in Rome was like wearing your identity on your sleeve. Quite literally, everyone knows about the toga, that massive woolen garment that's become synonymous with Roman civilization. But here's a secret. Romans only wore togas for special occasions because they were incredibly difficult to manage. Most days people wore simple tunics, and these humble garments told entire stories about who you were. Senators walked around with broad purple stripes across their tunics, while the equestrians, those lower aristocrats, wore narrower stripes. It was like having your social media profile written across your chest. Both Roman men and women loved their jewelry, adorning themselves with rings and bracelets, necklaces, and earrings. The wealthy sparkled with gold and precious gems, while others found beauty in simpler materials. There's something timeless about this human desire to decorate ourselves, to carry a little bit of beauty with us, wherever we go. When Romans wanted entertainment, they thought big. Really big. The Colosseum stands as perhaps the most incredible testament to their love of spectacle. Picture 50,000 people gathering to watch gladiators fight, or to see mock naval battles staged in a flooded arena. It's almost impossible to imagine the logistics of filling an entire amphitheater with water, just for a show, but the Romans made it happen. They also adored theatre, particularly comedies that would leave audiences laughing until their sides ached. Every town worth its salt had a theatre, and performances were woven into religious festivals, making entertainment and spirituality dance together in the most delightful way. The marketplace, or forum, was where the real pulse of Roman life could be felt. Merchants would spread their wares under the Mediterranean sun, selling everything from everyday necessities to exotic treasures from the far reaches of the empire. Spices from India, silk from China, amber from the Baltic, all of these wonders flowed along Roman roads that stretched like arteries across the known world. Those roads, by the way, were marvels of engineering that we still admire today. The Romans understood that connecting distant places wasn't just about moving armies, it was about moving ideas, goods, and dreams. Every stone laid on those roads was a step toward creating something larger than any one city or region could achieve alone. What strikes me most about Roman society is how it contained such incredible contrasts, like a painting with the brightest highlights and the deepest shadows. Wealthy Romans would recline on silk cushions, feasting on delicacies brought from across the empire, while just down the street, families crowded into tiny apartments, sharing simple meals of bread and vegetables. Yet somehow, they were all part of the same grand experiment in human civilization. The Romans created something that had never existed before, a world where a person could travel from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, and still be within the boundaries of a single empire. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, ate different foods, but they were all Romans. It's a beautiful reminder that human civilization is always a work in progress, always finding new ways to bring people together, even across vast distances and cultural differences. Picture yourself walking through the streets of ancient Rome, where the air itself seemed to pulse with ambition and engineering genius. The ground beneath your feet told its own story, paved with stones so carefully fitted that many of these roads would outlast empires yet to come. Water flowed through the city in ways that would make modern planners envious, carried by aqueducts that stretched for miles, bringing fresh mountain water to every corner of the urban sprawl. The smell of bread drifted from countless bakeries, mixing with the Mediterranean aromas of olive oil and wine that defined Roman tables. For the wealthy, meals became theatrical productions, featuring delicacies that sound almost mythical today. Peacock tongues prepared with exotic spices, dormice stuffed and roasted as appetizers. These weren't just meals, they were statements of power and prosperity. Meanwhile, in the cramped quarters of the city's towering apartment blocks, families gathered around simpler fare, bread and porridge, vegetables when they could afford them, yet even the poorest Romans diluted their wine with water, maintaining this sacred ritual that connected every citizen to their shared culture. These towering apartment buildings, called insulae, rose like ancient skyscrapers, sometimes reaching 6 or 7 stories high. Fire was a constant terror in these wooden structures, and collapses weren't uncommon. Families crowded into single rooms, sharing space and stories, their lives playing out in vertical neighborhoods, where your upstairs neighbor's footsteps became the rhythm of your daily existence. The contrast with the wealthy was stark and immediate. Just streets away, patrician families sprawled across elegant villas, decorated with mosaics that depicted everything from hunting scenes to geometric patterns so intricate they seemed to move in the lamplight. The heart of Roman social life beat strongest in the amphitheaters, those massive stone bowls that could swallow entire crowds. Tens of thousands of people would gather, their voices rising in unified roars as gladiators faced wild beasts, as chariots thundered around tight turns, wheels spinning dangerously close to the barriers. These weren't just entertainment venues, they were places where social boundaries temporarily dissolved, where a slave could cheer beside a senator, where the collective excitement of the crowd created something larger than individual identity. Religion wove through every aspect of Roman existence, like golden thread through expensive fabric. The pantheon of gods wasn't distant or abstract. These deities walked among mortals in the Roman imagination. Jupiter's thunder echoed through their weather, Venus blessed their love affairs, Mars guided their armies to victory. Temples weren't just buildings, they were active centers of community life, where people came to make offerings, seek guidance, and participate in festivals that could last for days. When emperors began to be worshipped as gods, it wasn't entirely strange to Roman thinking. Power and divinity had always been closely connected in their worldview. Education created its own form of social architecture in Roman society. In wealthy households, children grew up surrounded by private tutors, learning to speak multiple languages, studying philosophy that would shape their thinking for life, mastering rhetoric that would serve them in the courts and senate. They memorized poetry and learned mathematics, preparing for lives of leadership and leisure. Poorer children learned different lessons, watching their parents work, absorbing trades through observation and practice, developing skills that were no less valuable, that led to very different destinies. Roman law became something like a living organism, growing and adapting over centuries, building precedent upon precedent until it formed a complex system that could handle disputes across a vast empire. The concept that a person was innocent until proven guilty, revolutionary in its time, emerged from this careful legal thinking. Courts became theaters of their own kind, where skilled orators could sway juries with carefully crafted arguments, where justice and performance intersected in ways that would influence legal systems for millennia to come. The Roman household, the domus, functioned as more than just a living space. It was an economic unit, a social structure, and a reflection of cosmic order. The paterfamilias ruled this domestic realm with authority that extended over wife, children, slaves, and sometimes extended family members. Gardens provided both practical herbs and beautiful spaces for contemplation. Dining rooms hosted elaborate dinner parties that could stretch long into the night, Bedrooms offered privacy in a world where private space was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Music drifted through Roman evenings as people played lyres and flutes, attended theatrical performances where actors wore masks that exaggerated every emotion, where comedies and tragedies explored the full range of human experience. These weren't just diversions, they were ways of processing the complexities of life in an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, where different cultures and traditions constantly collided and merged. The Mediterranean landscape shaped Roman cuisine in fundamental ways. Olive groves and vineyards, stretched across hillsides, wheat fields, provided the grain that became the bread that sustained millions of lives. This connection to the land remained strong, even as Roman civilization became increasingly urban and sophisticated. The rhythms of harvest and planting still dictated many aspects of daily life. Religious festivals often aligned with agricultural seasons, creating a calendar that honored both gods and growing cycles. Social hierarchy in Rome wasn't just about wealth, though wealth certainly mattered. It was about ancestry, citizenship, legal status, and cultural knowledge. Patricians traced their lineages back through generations, their family names carrying weight in political and social negotiations. Plebeians, the common people, developed their own forms of organization and influence, sometimes challenging patrician authority through strikes and protests. Slaves, despite their legal status, often possessed skills and knowledge that made them valuable beyond their economic worth. Some eventually bought their freedom and established their own businesses and families. Public baths became social centers where Romans of different classes mingled, sharing gossip and conducting business, while soaking in hot pools fed by the same advanced plumbing systems that supplied their homes. These weren't just places to get clean, they were community centers where friendships formed, deals were struck, and the social fabric of Roman life was woven and rewoven daily. The forum buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk, merchants hawking goods from across the empire, politicians giving speeches, citizens conducting legal business, children running between the columns while their parents negotiated the complexities of urban life. This open space represented Roman ideals about public life and civic participation, even as the reality often fell short of the ideals. All of these elements, the grand and the humble, the public and the private, combined to create a civilization that managed to maintain its essential character across centuries and vast distances, adapting to local conditions while spreading Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman culture, and Roman ambitions to the farthest corners of the known world. Picture, if you will, a Roman child waking up as the sun begins to cast long shadows across the cobblestones. The air is crisp, filled with the sounds of a bustling empire coming to life. Education in ancient Rome was something quite different from what we know today, yet remarkably familiar in its ambitions. The Romans believed deeply in shaping young minds, much as we do now. They understood that knowledge was power, that words could move mountains, and that a well-trained tongue could open doors that gold could not. But their approach, their methods, carried the weight of tradition and the sting of discipline. Most Roman children who received formal education were boys. This wasn't entirely by choice, but by custom, by the way society had arranged itself over centuries. Girls often learned at home, their education focused on the skills that society expected them to master. It was a different world, with different rules, different expectations. The first stop on a young Roman's educational journey was the house of illiterature. These were the teachers of reading and writing, the guardians of Latin, that magnificent language that would echo through history long after the empire had crumbled to dust. The literator's room was far from quiet. Children's voices would fill the air, reciting lessons in unison, their words blending into a chorus of learning. This education came at a price, literally. Families paid for their children's schooling, and the cost varied depending on the teacher's reputation. Some literators were renowned throughout their neighborhoods, their fame built on the success of their former students. Others were humble craftsmen of knowledge, doing their best with fewer resources. The sound of children reciting filled these rooms from dawn to dusk. Unlike our modern classrooms, where quiet concentration is prized, Roman education was loud, communal, almost musical in its rhythm. Students learned by repetition, by speaking aloud, by making the words part of their very breath. Once a child mastered the basics of reading and writing, they would advance to study under a grammaticus. These teachers opened doors to literature, to the great works that had shaped civilization. Here, young Romans would encounter the epic tales of Homer, the wisdom of ancient philosophers, the poetry that stirred hearts across the Mediterranean. The Grammaticus taught more than just words on a page. They revealed the cultural treasures that Rome had inherited and adapted. Greek literature was particularly prized, for the Romans recognized the brilliance of Greek civilization and sought to make it their own. Students learned to write in Greek as well as Latin, becoming citizens of two intellectual worlds. Rhetoric. The art of persuasive speaking was perhaps the most valuable skill a Roman student could acquire. In a society where public speaking could make or break a career, where words in the forum could sway the fate of nations, the ability to speak well was like possessing a magical power. Students practiced crafting arguments, learning to bend language to their will, to make their voices carry weight and authority. For the wealthy, education didn't stop there. The final stage was studying rhetoric and philosophy at the highest level, what we might think of as university education today. This prepared young men for careers in politics and law, the pinnacles of Roman achievement. These were the paths that led to the Senate, to the courts, to positions where one could shape the destiny of the empire itself. But formal schooling was just one part of Roman intellectual life. The empire was filled with libraries, both public and private, their shelves heavy with scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of ages. These weren't quiet, dusty repositories, but living centers of learning where scholars gathered to debate and discuss. Public lectures drew crowds of educated Romans eager to engage with new ideas. Philosophical discussions could stretch late into the evening, as men debated questions that had puzzled humanity for centuries. The boundaries between entertainment and education blurred in these gatherings, where brilliant minds sparked off one another like flint against steel. Yet, this educational system had its critics, even in its own time. Some Romans worried that too much focus on Greek culture was weakening traditional Roman values. They feared that their children were becoming more Greek than Roman, losing touch with the customs and beliefs that had built the empire in the first place. Others criticized the harsh discipline common in Roman schools. Physical punishment was not just accepted, but expected as part of education. Teachers wielded their authority with rods and switches, believing that learning required not just mental effort, but physical endurance. It was a world where education and pain walked hand in hand. Despite these concerns, the Roman education system shaped generations of citizens who would go on to create laws, literature, and architectural marvels that still inspire us today. It was a system that valued tradition while embracing foreign wisdom, that prized discipline while nurturing creativity. The echoes of those ancient classrooms still resonate today. Our own educational traditions trace their roots back to those Roman innovations, those methods refined over centuries of trial and error. The emphasis on rhetoric, on literature, on the power of the written and spoken word. These gifts from Rome continue to shape how we think about learning. As the Roman day drew to a close and the voices of students finally fell silent, the scrolls would be carefully stored away, the lessons of the day absorbed into young minds that would carry them forward into an uncertain future. Picture waking up in ancient Rome, and the very first thing you'd notice would be the sounds drifting through your window, the clatter of wooden wheels on stone streets, voices calling out from every direction, the distant hum of a city that never seemed to truly sleep. But it wasn't chaos. Not really. It was more like a symphony that had been playing for centuries, each note perfectly placed in a rhythm that Romans understood instinctively. The heart of this daily symphony was the marketplace, or as they called it, the Mela. Now, imagine walking into one of these markets on any given morning. The smell would hit you first. A mixture of fresh bread, olive oil, and something you couldn't quite identify, but that made your stomach growl. These weren't the sterile grocery stores we know today. They were alive, breathing spaces where the entire community came together. You'd see farmers who had walked for hours before dawn, carrying baskets of vegetables still damp with morning dew. Their hands were rough from working the soil, but their eyes sparkled when they talked about their crops. Next to them, fishermen displayed their catch, the silver scales catching the early sunlight like tiny mirrors. The fish were so fresh they might have been swimming in the Mediterranean just hours before. The bakers, now they were the real artists of the marketplace. They'd arrived before anyone else, kneading dough in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time the market opened, the aroma of their bread would drift through the streets like an invisible invitation. Romans took their bread seriously, you see. It wasn't just food, it was the foundation of every meal, the thing that kept the empire running. But the marketplace wasn't just about food. Wander a little further, and you'd find pottery makers, their hands still clay-stained from the morning's work. Their vessels weren't just functional, they were beautiful, decorated with patterns that told stories of gods and heroes. Clothing vendors displayed tunics and togas in every shade imaginable, from deep purples that cost more than most people made in a year, to simple undyed wool that everyone could afford. Then there were the more sobering stalls, where human lives were bought and sold like any other commodity. Slavery was woven so deeply into Roman society that most people barely gave it a second thought. It's one of those historical realities that reminds us how different their world was from ours, how what seems normal in one era can seem unthinkable in another. The haggling. Oh, the haggling. It was an art form unto itself. Buyers and sellers would dance around prices like they were performing an elaborate ritual. Coins would clink against each other, creating a constant percussion that mixed with the voices and footsteps and animal sounds. To an outsider, it might have seemed like complete chaos. But Romans navigated it all with the ease of people who had grown up in this beautiful, noisy world. What's fascinating is how simple their daily diet actually was, despite all the exotic goods flowing through their markets. Grain was everything. They ground it into flour, baked it into bread, and it appeared on tables from the poorest apartments to the grandest villas. Olive oil wasn't just for cooking, it was for lighting lamps, cleaning skin, even treating wounds. Wine flowed like water, and not just because Romans loved to drink. The water wasn't always safe, but wine, with its alcohol content, was usually reliable. They ate fruits and vegetables we'd recognize today. Apples and pears, cherries that grew wild on hillsides, onions that made cooks weep, just like they do now. Lentils and beans provided protein for people who couldn't afford meat very often, because meat, that was special. Most Romans might taste it a few times a year, during festivals or celebrations. The wealthy, of course, dined on elaborate meat dishes regularly, but for the average person, a piece of fish was more likely to grace their table than a cut of beef. The empire's massive coastline meant that even inland cities could enjoy fresh seafood. Fish sellers would pack their catches in salt and ice, racing against time to get them to market before they spoiled. There's something almost magical about imagining a fish caught off the coast of what we now call Spain, ending up on a dinner table in the heart of modern-day France, all because of Roman roads and Roman determination. As evening approached and the marketplace began to wind down, Romans didn't simply go home and sleep. The night was when the city truly came alive in a different way. Theatre was enormous, especially comedy. Romans loved to laugh, and their comedies could be bawdy, clever, satirical. Imagine sitting in one of those massive outdoor theatres, the stones still warm from the day's sun, watching actors in elaborate masks making fun of politicians and social customs. The theatres themselves were architectural marvels. Built into hillsides when possible, they could seat thousands of people, and the acoustics were so perfect that someone in the back row could hear every word spoken on stage. People would bring snacks, settle in for hours, and lose themselves in stories of gods and mortals, love and betrayal, triumph and comedy. But if theatre was popular, Gladiatorial games were absolutely magnetic. It's hard for us to understand now, this appetite for watching people fight to the death for entertainment. The games weren't just random violence, though. They were carefully choreographed spectacles with different types of gladiators trained in specific fighting styles. There were rules, rituals, ceremonies that turned brutality into something Romans saw as art. The crowds at these games were unlike anything we see today. Tens of thousands of people, all social classes mixed together, screaming and cheering and holding their breath. The emperor himself would attend, giving thumbs up or thumbs down to determine whether a defeated gladiator lived or died. It was democracy of a sort, but a democracy built on blood and sand. Yet for all their love of spectacle, Romans were also deeply intellectual. Education wasn't just for the elite. Schools existed throughout the empire where children learned to read and write. They studied rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively, because in a society where public debate mattered, knowing how to argue your point could change your life. The Romans had tremendous respect for Greek culture and learning. They saw themselves as inheritors of Greek wisdom, but with a more practical bent. Where Greeks might debate the nature of reality for hours, Romans wanted to know how to build better roads, create fairer laws, organize more efficient governments. They read Plato and Aristotle, but they also wrote manuals on engineering and agriculture. Their legal system was perhaps their greatest intellectual achievement. The 12 Tables, their earliest written laws, established principles that still influence legal systems today. The idea that laws should be written down, publicly available, equally applied, these weren't obvious concepts in the ancient world. Most societies operated on the whims of rulers or the interpretations of priests, but Romans believed in something more systematic, more fair. They had courts and judges, procedures for trials, rights for defendants. It wasn't perfect. Justice still depended heavily on your social status and wealth, but it was revolutionary for its time. The legal concepts they developed, things like innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, the importance of evidence, these ideas traveled along Roman roads and survived long after the empire fell. When evening finally gave way to night and Romans headed home, the differences in their society became starkest. The poor climbed narrow staircases to tiny apartments in buildings called insulae. These were often 5 or 6 stories tall, rickety structures that regularly caught fire or collapsed. Families might share a single room, cooking over small braziers, hauling water up from street level, emptying waste buckets every morning. Meanwhile, the wealthy retreated to spacious villas with private gardens, elaborate mosaics depicting scenes from mythology, rooms dedicated to specific purposes. They had running water, heated floors, private baths. Their evening meals might include delicacies imported from across the empire, exotic spices, rare wines, entertainment provided by trained musicians and dancers. This inequality wasn't seen as a problem to be solved, but as a natural order to be maintained. Romans believed in hierarchy, in the idea that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to serve. It's another reminder of how different their worldview was, how they could create legal systems based on fairness while accepting massive social disparities as inevitable. As night settled over the city, and oil lamps flickered in windows across 7 hills, Rome became something different yet again. The daytime bustle gave way to quieter sounds. Conversations drifting from doorways, the occasional patrol of city guards, the distant sound of water flowing through aqueducts that never stopped bringing fresh mountain water to the city's fountains. In the darkness, Rome dreamed. Merchants dreamed of profitable trades. Soldiers dreamed of glorious victories. Slaves dreamed of freedom. Children dreamed of growing up to change the world. And perhaps, in those dreams, the contradictions of Roman life, the violence and beauty, the fairness and inequality, the sophistication and brutality, somehow made sense in ways they never quite did in daylight. The echoes of those dreams, those daily rhythms of marketplace and theatre, law court and arena, humble apartment and grand villa, they ripple forward through centuries, touching our own lives in ways we rarely stop to consider. Every time we watch a play, participate in a trial, walk through a market, buy fresh bread, we're participating in traditions that began on those 7 hills beside the Tiber River, in a city that thought it would last forever. Picture ancient Rome, where powerful families quietly controlled everything behind the scenes. These patricians, as they were called, had been pulling the strings for generations. Their bloodlines stretched back to Rome's very beginning, like invisible threads connecting past and present. The Romans loved to talk about their republic, their democracy, their freedom. Every year they would hold grand elections, choosing 2 consuls to run the state. It was quite the spectacle, really. Citizens would gather, speeches would be made, votes would be counted. But here's the thing, these consuls always came from the same small circle of senators, about 300 men who truly ran the show. The Senate, that's where the real power lived. These senators made the big decisions, declared wars, negotiated peace treaties. They also picked those consuls we mentioned, which naturally led to some rather intense competition. Sometimes this rivalry got so heated that blood was shed right there in the forum. Now, Rome wasn't just about consuls and senators. The government was like a well-oiled machine with many moving parts. There were praetors who served as judges, settling disputes and interpreting laws. The aediles took care of public buildings and organized those famous Roman festivals. Quaestors managed the treasury, counting coins and tracking expenses. Then you had the censors, fascinating fellows who not only conducted the census, but also kept an eye on everyone's moral behavior. The common people, the plebeians, they weren't completely powerless in this system. They had their own officials called tribunes, and these tribunes possessed something quite remarkable. They could veto any decision made by the Senate. Just like that, with a single word, they could stop the most powerful men in Rome. It was democracy's small victory in an oligarchy's world. But let's be honest about something. Corruption flowed through Roman politics like wine at a banquet. Elections were bought and sold like goods in the marketplace. Wealthy men would simply purchase political offices, treating them as investments. Once in power, these politicians would use their positions to grow even richer. It was a cycle that fed on itself, growing stronger with each generation. This corruption, this greed, it slowly ate away at the Republic like rust on iron. The system that had built an empire began to crumble from within. Civil wars erupted. Brother fought brother. And from this chaos emerged a man named Julius Caesar. Caesar was different, charismatic in a way that made people believe in him. He seized power, not through birthright or wealth alone, but through sheer force of personality and military genius. When he declared himself dictator for life, the old republic gasped its final breath. Of course, power gained by the sword often ends the same way. Caesar's assassination was swift, brutal, and ultimately pointless. From the blood and confusion that followed, his adopted son Octavian rose to claim the throne. Taking the name Augustus, he became Rome's first emperor, though he was clever enough never to call himself that. Under Augustus and the emperors who followed, the Senate became something like a museum piece. Still there, still meeting, still debating, but without real power. The emperor made the decisions that mattered, commanded the armies, shaped the destiny of millions, yet they maintained the fiction of the republic, letting the old institutions continue their ceremonial dance. This political theatre wasn't just about Rome itself. It governed an empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Spanish silver and Syrian silk, British wool and Egyptian grain all flowed toward Rome under this system. The empire was vast beyond imagination, diverse beyond comprehension. Dozens of languages echoed through its cities. Hundreds of gods received worship in its temples. Countless customs and traditions lived side by side. Yet somehow, this complex and often corrupt political structure held it all together for centuries. What's remarkable is how this system evolved, how it adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The Republic died, but something of its spirit lived on in the Empire. The Empire centralized power, but it never forgot the importance of appearing democratic. Picture a city where nearly 1 million souls called home, where the morning sun would cast long shadows across bustling streets that never seemed to sleep. Rome at its peak was something extraordinary, a place where human ambition had built something truly magnificent. The wealthy Romans, they lived in these stunning houses called domus, arranged around beautiful open courtyards that caught the light just so. You'd walk through the front door and find yourself in this peaceful atrium, where families gathered and conducted their daily business. These weren't just homes, they were statements, decorated with the most intricate mosaics you could imagine, tiny colored stones arranged into pictures that told stories of gods and heroes. But here's the thing about ancient cities. They were just like ours in many ways. Most people, the everyday Romans, they didn't live in fancy houses at all. They packed themselves into these tall apartment buildings, called insula, sometimes climbing 4 or 5 stories up narrow wooden stairs. The smell of cooking food would drift through thin walls, and neighbors knew each other's business, whether they wanted to or not. Life in those apartments could be pretty rough, actually. Fires broke out all the time, spreading quickly through the wooden structures. Sometimes entire buildings would just collapse, poor construction catching up with desperate landlords who'd cut too many corners. Yet somehow, people made it work, creating communities within these cramped spaces. The city itself was divided into neighborhoods, each one like a little village within the greater whole. Local officials kept things running, made sure the streets stayed somewhat clean, settled disputes between merchants and customers. Walking through Rome would have felt familiar to anyone who's wandered through a busy modern city. That same energy of people going about their lives, buying bread, gossiping with friends, hurrying to appointments. Water. Now that's where the Romans really showed their genius. They built these incredible aqueducts, stone channels that carried fresh mountain water across miles and miles of countryside, right into the heart of the city. Some of these ancient waterways still stand today, graceful arches marching across the landscape like frozen music. The engineering behind them, the precise calculations needed to make water flow gently downhill for dozens of miles, it's the kind of achievement that makes you wonder what we might accomplish if we really set our minds to it. That water fed the public baths, these amazing social centers where Romans of all classes would gather. The baths weren't just about getting clean. They were like community centers, gyms and libraries all rolled into one. You'd soak in hot pools, exercise in the courtyard, maybe catch up on the latest political gossip or philosophical debates. Rich merchants might find themselves discussing business next to senators, slaves serving everyone with practiced efficiency. The Colosseum rises in our imagination like a stone mountain, this massive amphitheater where 50,000 people could gather to watch spectacles that seem almost unreal today. Gladiators fighting for their lives, exotic animals brought from the far corners of the empire, even mock naval battles where they'd flood the arena and stage entire sea conflicts. The roar of that crowd must have been something to hear. But if you really wanted to see Romans at their most passionate, you'd head to the Circus Maximus for chariot racing. Picture a stadium that could hold 150,000 screaming fans, more people than some entire cities contained. The thunder of hooves, the crack of whips, drivers risking everything for glory and gold, while the crowd went absolutely wild with excitement. The Roman Forum served as the beating heart of it all, where senators debated the fate of nations and merchants struck deals that would echo across continents. Ancient columns still stand there today, silent witnesses to conversations that shaped the world we inherited. You can almost hear the echoes of long-dead voices, arguing over taxes and treaties, love and war. Even waste management became an art form in Roman hands. The Cloaca Maxima, their great sewer system, carried away the city's refuse through tunnels large enough to walk through. They appointed public doctors, distributed free grain to prevent riots, created systems that kept nearly 1 million people alive and relatively healthy, in an age when such things seemed impossible. What strikes you most about ancient Rome is how it contained multitudes, how the greatest luxury existed right alongside the most basic struggles. A senator might live in marble splendor while just down the street, entire families crowded into single rooms, dreaming their own dreams of prosperity and peace. The artisans who created those beautiful frescoes, painting mythical scenes on villa walls, they were creating beauty that would outlast empires. The slaves who carried water, who swept streets, who cooked meals in tiny apartment kitchens, they were living lives full of hope and sorrow, just like people everywhere, in every time. There's something deeply moving about imagining all those individual stories playing out against the backdrop of such grand architecture. Children playing games in the shadow of monuments, lovers meeting by moonlight near ancient fountains, old men sharing wine and wisdom as the sun set over 7 hills that had seen so much history unfold. Rome reminds us that humans have always been capable of creating something greater than themselves, that even in ages we call ancient, people were building, dreaming, reaching for permanence in a world that never stops changing. Those stones still standing today, they're messages from people who believed their civilization would last forever. And in a way, perhaps it has. Picture the ancient city of Rome at the height of its power, when it truly was the center of the known world. The streets would buzz with energy from dawn until dusk, filled with people from every corner of the vast empire. You could hear dozens of languages being spoken as merchants, soldiers, and travelers mingled together in this great melting pot of civilization. The smell of exotic spices would drift through the air, carried by traders who had journeyed thousands of miles along those famous Roman roads. These weren't just simple dirt paths, mind you. They were masterpieces of engineering, paved with stone so precisely cut that many still exist today. The saying goes that all roads led to Rome, and in those days, that really felt true. Imagine walking through the markets in the early morning hours. Vendors would be setting up their stalls, calling out in melodic voices to attract customers. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, would compete with the aroma of imported cinnamon and pepper from distant lands. Silk merchants would display their precious fabrics, shimmering in colors that most people had never seen before. The social divide in Roman society was as vast as the empire itself. At the very top lived the patricians, Rome's aristocratic elite. Their homes were like palaces, decorated with paintings so lifelike they seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. Intricate mosaics covered their floors, telling stories of gods and heroes with thousands of tiny colored stones. These wealthy Romans would host dinner parties that lasted for hours, where guests reclined on couches while servants brought course of exotic delicacies. Down in the heart of the city, life looked completely different. The common people, called plebeians, lived in tall apartment buildings that rose several stories high. These structures, known as insulae, housed entire families in just 1 or 2 small rooms. Despite the cramped conditions, there was a sense of community that bound these neighborhoods together. People knew their neighbors, shared meals, and looked out for each other's children. Water was something Romans took very seriously, and they built some of the most impressive systems ever created to bring it into their city. Massive stone channels called aqueducts carried fresh mountain water across valleys and hills, traveling dozens of miles to reach Rome. This wasn't just for drinking, though that was certainly important. Romans loved their baths, and these weren't simple places to get clean. The public bathhouses were like social clubs, gyms and spas all rolled into one. People from all walks of life would spend hours there, moving from room to room as the temperature gradually increased. They had cold pools, warm pools, and rooms so hot they were filled with steam. The floors were heated by a clever system of underground furnaces, making even the coldest winter days comfortable. Friends would meet there to discuss business, politics, or simply to gossip about their neighbors. Education meant everything to Roman parents who could afford it. They believed that knowledge was the key to success, so they hired private teachers for their children. These tutors would arrive at dawn, carrying scrolls filled with lessons in reading, writing, and mathematics. Students learned to speak both Latin and Greek. Since educated Romans were expected to master both languages, they studied the stars, learned to play musical instruments, and memorized the works of great philosophers. The gods were everywhere in Roman life, watching over every activity from the most important state ceremonies to the simplest daily tasks. Romans believed that dozens of different deities controlled everything from the weather to the outcome of business deals. Before making any important decision, they would consult priests who would examine the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals, looking for signs of divine approval. Justice in Rome was surprisingly modern in some ways. Citizens accused of crimes had the right to defend themselves in court, and judges were supposed to assume innocence until guilt was proven. Of course, having money and connections certainly helped your case, and bribery was unfortunately common. Still, for its time, the Roman legal system was remarkably fair and organized. When darkness fell over the city, a different kind of life would emerge. Oil lamps would flicker to life in taverns and wine shops, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Musicians would tune their instruments while storytellers prepared their most captivating tales. The great amphitheaters would host spectacular shows that could hold 50,000 spectators, all cheering as gladiators fought or chariots raced around the track at breakneck speed. Street food vendors would light their braziers, offering hot meals to workers heading home after long days. Children would play games in the narrow alleys, while their parents sat outside, enjoying the cooler evening air. Even in the poorest neighborhoods, there was music, laughter, and the warmth of human connection. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the possibility for advancement that Roman society offered. A slave could earn or buy their freedom and become a respected citizen. A farmer's son could join the army, distinguish himself in battle, and return home wealthy enough to enter politics. Stories abounded of plebeians who rose to become senators, generals, or successful merchants through talent, hard work, and a bit of luck. The architectural wonders of Rome still inspire awe today, but imagine seeing them when they were new, their marble surfaces gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun. The Pantheon's great dome seemed to float impossibly overhead, while the Colosseum rose like a man-made mountain from the city's heart. These weren't just buildings, they were statements of power, creativity, and human ambition, reaching toward the heavens. In this ancient world, every day brought the possibility of encountering something extraordinary, whether it was a merchant from Egypt displaying precious jewels, a philosopher from Greece sharing wisdom in the Forum, or simply the sight of the sun setting behind the 7 hills that cradled this eternal city.